On his orders, people were burned alive, drowned, impaled, and cut in half. He had 7 wives and became known as the Black Widower. And finally, he brutally murdered his own son Ivan with his staff. The bloody crimes of the first Russian Tsar are well known throughout the world. But the reasons for his tyranny, as well as his personality, are still shrouded in mystery and lies. In Europe, he is still considered to be the most murderous of medieval rulers. Nobody mentions that during his reign, Ivan the Terrible only slaughtered 3,000 people. This many were killed in a single day during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris. He is remembered for being much crueler than he actually was. The Tsar's contemporaries were grateful to him. They believed that by killing the sinners, he was saving their souls before the end of the world. He was devoted to his family. So where did the rumors about him killing his own wives come from? Nor did he kill his son Ivan. So why has the myth survived for so long, eclipsing all his many achievements? During his life, he trebled Russian territory, established book printing, built St. Basil's Cathedral, and even wrote a few musical compositions. Few people know that the author of this divine music is Ivan the Terrible. Genius and evil often go hand in hand. Many tyrants before and after Ivan the Terrible were sentimental and used to enjoy musical poetry. Adolf Hitler was a fine landscape painter. Josef Stalin perfectly described nature in his poetry. It was Stalin's will that director Sergei Eisenstein created the most famous movie depiction of Ivan the Terrible. To the murderous Soviet leader, the first Russian Tsar was a spiritual teacher and an example to many. Thanks to Stalin, the world would find out how Ivan the Terrible really looked. Sculptor and anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov was willing to reconstruct the Tsar's face using his skull. At first, Stalin was very interested in this project. But then he changed his mind and didn't give permission to exhume Ivan the Terrible's remains. Memories of the Gerasimov's fatal opening of Tamerlane's tomb in the Gure Amir Mausoleum were still fresh. On June 21, 1941, scientists removed the remains of the warrior emperor, ignoring the inscription on the wall warning, "Whoever opens this tomb will release God of War." A day later, war broke out. Unlike Gure Amir's mausoleum, the ancestral tomb of Ivan the Terrible had no warnings. But there was quite enough mysticism around the Tsar's name. The writer Vsevolod Garshin committed suicide by jumping out of a window right after posing for Repin's painting Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan. The actor Nikolai Kamelev died on the Moscow Art Theatre stage dressed as Ivan the Terrible. Eisenstein's two-part film, Ivan the Terrible, remained unfinished. While working on the second part, the director suddenly died of a heart attack. The mystery surrounding Ivan the Terrible is ongoing. Evgeny Evstigniev starred as Ivan the Terrible in the film Yermak, and 10 days later, he died. Oleg Borisov died shortly after playing the role of Ivan in the movie The Storm Over Russia. During the filming of this movie, actor Yuri Astafyev died of a heart attack. Actors Sergei Bondarchuk, Vaclav Dvoretsky, and director Alexei Saltykov died shortly before the premiere of the same movie. This must have been more than just a coincidence. On the orders of Nikita Khrushchev, archaeologists and criminologists opened the tomb of Ivan the Terrible in the 1950s. The new General Secretary knew that Stalin admired Ivan the Terrible. Khrushchev wanted to prove that Stalin's favorite historical character was a murderous tyrant. Using the remains of the skull of Ivan the Terrible, Gerasimov restored his sculptural portrait, and all doubts vanished. Such a person could be capable of anything. An ominous hooked nose, a face full of disgust and cruelty. Only on closer examination could one see his deep sadness and self-loathing. These are the features not of a cruel ruler, but of a common man nearing death with a heavy heart. But what was depressing the murderous tyrant? Moscow was trembling from peals of thunder and lightning. People cried out, just as the Holy Fool predicted. On that day was born the son of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan. And according to prophecy, his reign would be as troublesome as that rainy day. Prince Vasily III was infinitely happy. Finally, he was holding his successor in his arms. He had been waiting for this moment for 25 years. For the sake of this tiny creature, he had committed a crime. He had locked his first wife, the Baron Solomonia Sabarova, to a monastery. He was told that the enraged woman was cursing him and his new family. But the Tsar wasn't worried. He was sure that with his new wife, the Lithuanian princess Elena Glinskaya, who was half his age, he would soon become a father. For 4 long years, the princess could not become pregnant. Was this because of the curse? If so, he would need to kill his former wife. Solomonia was saved by the news that Elena Glinskaya had finally become pregnant. But Vasily III's happiness was short-lived. He only enjoyed his long-awaited successor Ivan for 3 years, and his second son Yuri for just a few moments after his birth. An abscess on the prince's thigh led to blood poisoning and a quick death. His wife was widowed, and her young sons were now orphans. Before his death, Prince Vasily III bequeathed his throne to 3-year-old Ivan. But up until the age of 15, his mother regent and 7 boyar tutors remained by his side. After the funeral, these tutors, instead of taking care of the little prince, started fighting over who would be the main tutor. They became competitive and started poisoning each other, dreaming of changing their boyar's hat for a monomax cap. They ignored Tsarina and young Ivan. A boyar's rebellion was in the air. Elena Glinskaya realized that both she and her son were in danger. She took matters into her own hands, ordering an immediate currency reform. Counterfeiters were becoming increasingly brazen, so it was necessary to put new money into circulation. In fact, the princess had an ulterior motive. Earlier silver coins had shown a horseman wielding a sword. He was replaced by a spearman. The word kopya, spear, gave the coin its name, kopyeka. The horseman on the coins looked like an iconographical image of St. George the Victorious, the patron saint of Moscow, with one difference. St. George had the face of Ivan Vasilievich, confirmed by the inscription on the coin. Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia Ivan. Elena ordered the manufacture of these coins so that the people would know their Tsar and not confuse him with impostors. But another danger lurked. In Moscow, there were persistent rumors that the first wife of late prince, the nun Solomonia, gave birth to the Tsar's heir in a monastery. And now Ivan had a dangerous rival who could claim his right to the throne. Solomonia herself hadn't denied these rumors. When Vasily III was still alive, he was very concerned about the rumors and had even sent inspectors to the monastery. But Solomonia refused to show them her son George. The day would come when her son would become Tsar and take revenge for his mother. Vasily III was outraged by these threats. He had sent boyars and high-ranking ecclesiastics to the monastery. Solomonia didn't dare resist such a respected delegation. She was forced to admit that her son George, the Tsar's descendant, had died shortly after his birth. And she even showed his grave to the commission. But still, the shadow of an older brother would haunt Ivan the Terrible for a long time. The reason was both real and mystical. In 1934, the chief of Suzdal Museum, Alexei Varganov, organized excavations in Pokrovsky Monastery. Suddenly, between the graves of two nuns, he noticed a nameless tomb. The researcher was astonished. What if it's the legendary grave of Prince George, the eldest son of Vasily III? After all, Solomonia, the disgraced wife of the Tsar, was buried next to this grave. The nameless grave was opened, but inside they only found a wooden doll in a silk dress. Why had Solomonia buried a doll? Did this child actually exist? If so, perhaps the mother wanted to protect her child from death. And if the kid did not exist, then the doll could only mean one thing: a ritual burial. Solomonia's contemporaries therefore accused her of witchcraft. Since childhood, he believed in Solomonia's curse. How else could he explain that people close to him were dying, including his mother and father and various other relatives? As time passes, the fear of this curse will turn Ivan into a murderous maniac. Suspicion turned to paranoia and a lust for revenge. His mother's fear for their safety had a profound effect on the young Ivan. At that time in Russia, the Grand Prince was not the sole ruler. He had to act in accordance with the top boyars, the oligarchy of the time. Ivan's father, Vasily III, was the first who tried to limit the boyars' power. Elena Glinskaya attempted to fulfill her husband's will. She didn't listen to the boyars and insisted on doing it alone. She wanted to be an example to her son, but she had no time. Ivan was in his 8th year when his beautiful mother started deteriorating in front of him. Elena Glinskaya tried to prevent the mysterious illness by visiting a shrine that seemed to have healing qualities. But public affairs were waiting for her in Moscow, and she had to return. In such a hostile environment, she relapsed. Ivan kept believing that his mother would recover until the moment of her death. Elena Glinskaya was buried suspiciously on the very same day. The reason for such haste has only just been revealed. A high concentration of mercury was found in her remains. This is a direct indication that she had been slowly poisoned. Ivan the Terrible often suspected that his loved ones were being poisoned, but he didn't realize that his mother had been poisoned. And so Ivan was left alone with his hostile tutors. He had become a powerless, lonely puppet, devoid of communication. The person he felt closest to, his younger brother Yuri, was a deaf and dumb cripple. Ivan's favorite nanny and the loyal boyars were killed or sent away. Soon, Ivan realized that they could not touch him. Despite his youth, the people and foreign guests saw him as the rightful ruler. During all great occasions and ambassadors' receptions, the prince was in the spotlight. But once the festivity was over, Ivan was forgotten about. Even for the basic necessities like food and water, he had to wait. He was left helplessly knocking at the closed door. They would only talk to Ivan to tell him about the rumors about his elder brother. They called him a bastard. Prince Andrew Shuisky was particularly cynical. While the boy was choking down stale bread, the boyar sat there with his dirty boots on his late mother's bed. With a nasty grin, he would recall the rumors about her affair with Fyodor Ovchina and how Ivan had been conceived in sin. The young Tsar silently took the insults, but he swore not to forget anything. The boy was often tormented by nightmares, but the dreams were suddenly interrupted by an even more terrible reality. In the middle of the night, in front of Ivan, Shuisky nearly killed the Metropolitan, who was devoted to the royal family and supported Vasily III in his desire to limit the power of the boyars. Trying to escape from death, the Metropolitan sought protection near the young ruler, but so far, Ivan had been powerless to do anything. He clenched his fists and dreamt of revenge. He took his rage out on cats, cutting off their tails and throwing them out of windows. The boyars turned a blind eye to his sadistic outbursts. In fact, they found them useful, dispatching their enemies using Ivan's hands. Just for fun, the boyars encouraged him to set dogs on objectionable people. As Ivan was growing up, 5 different ruling boyar factions had changed, each one trying to use the Tsar for their own purpose. But suddenly, for the first time, the Tsar took the initiative and set the dogs on his abuser, Andrew Shuisky. You see, when Boyar Shuisky told him, "God knows who got your mother pregnant," he handed him over to the huntsman. The prince's death was horrific. The boyars became scared. Suddenly, their puppet had become uncontrollable. Ivan is 16. A year had passed since gaining his majority and ridding himself of his tutors. And today, he will make his first step towards becoming sole leader. From now on, he will no longer be the Grand Prince of Moscow, but the Tsar of all Russia. In public, Ivan wore the monomach's cap and received the other tokens of supreme power. But his coronation was different from other Byzantine emperors and of Grand Prince Vladimir. Ivan was anointed. In every person's life, this ritual is held once, twice in a Tsar's life. The power of Ion IV was blessed by God. Back then, only two monarchs were called Tsars, the Byzantine Emperor and the Khan of the Golden Horde. By proclaiming himself Tsar, he brought himself up to the level of these monarchs. 2 weeks later, the royal crown was placed on Ivan's head once again. This time, he was getting married, swearing to be faithful until his death. Ivan had chosen Anastasia Zakharina among 1,500 candidates for the title of the first Tsarina of Russia. It was love at first sight. Ivan would keep her in his heart for the rest of his life. Hugging his young wife, he dreamt that they would live happily and die together. But it was not meant to be. His beloved wife would be beside him only for 13 happy years. Historians call those mystical 13 years the bloodless period. It is believed that he turned into a maniacal tyrant after the death of his beloved wife. In fact, his transformation began 6 months after his wedding, when for the first time, death looked him in the eye. That day, a disaster took place in the Kremlin. The big bell fell to the ground. It was an ominous sign. The young Tsar refused to believe in omens. The big bell had fallen from the Kremlin belfry. So what? He was fine. He had a loving family and unlimited power. Ivan was planning to introduce several government reforms and was preparing for a military campaign to increase his possessions. But soon he realized that even with the royal crown on his head, he was vulnerable to attacks from his enemies. He was the same boy whose destiny was not just to live, but to survive. A week after the fall of the bell, the Great Moscow Fire broke out. The city was in flames. People were burning to death. Their homes had turned to ashes. The fire raged for 2 days. Nearly 2,000 Muscovites died. People were talking of deliberate arson, then of God's judgment. They looked for a scapegoat. The boyars took advantage of the situation. They started a rumor that it was the Tsar's grandmother, Anna Glinskaya's fault. They accused her of witchcraft. People claimed she removed the hearts of dead men, turning them into ashes and scattering them over Moscow, disguised as a magpie to burn it down. In the 16th century, fables were easily believed, like the fable that the young Tsar himself was under these charms and his blood was spoiled, and that somewhere his elder brother, the son of Solomonia, the first wife of Vasily III, was growing up in secret. Maybe he would be a better ruler. An angry mob rushed to seek the royal grandparent witch. All of Glinsky's family suffered. People burned their possessions and rushed to a village near Moscow looking for the Tsars. They were hiding the young ruler with his family and friends. Ivan felt his life was in danger. For the first time, he faced people's rage and he was confused. He didn't know yet how to suppress a riot. And now he was scared. Soon he would be blamed for all the troubles and be torn to pieces. He was saved by the priest Sylvester, the confessor of Ivan's late mother, Elena Glinskaya, and devoted friend of the royal family. He appeared before the people and, like a prophet, started to blame the Tsar for his sins, as if they really had caused all the troubles. If the Tsar were to repent in public now, all disasters would cease. Sylvester led the Tsar out to the people. With tears of repentance, Ivan fell to his knees before the brutal mob. He asked for forgiveness from the people and God for his sins and those of his relatives. People were shocked. They were expecting anything but a sincere repentance. They waited in silence for a while and then humbly went away. Saved from the angry mob, Ivan felt gratitude and infinite trust towards the wise priest and treated him as his spiritual mentor. Sylvester was very religious and even exalted in his faith. He heard voices, saw signs, and with sparkling eyes, he repeated, "God's will is in everything." Very soon, under Sylvester's influence, the impulsive and insecure Ivan turned into a religious fanatic, convinced he was on a special mission. He was the only ruler crowned by God. Hence, no imaginary brother could claim his right. People will not riot again. He is God's vicar on earth, and he was as powerful as God. His reign would glorify Russia for centuries. 1552 and 1560 is the period of victories. He succeeded where both his grandfather and his father had failed. He occupied tremendous countries like Khanate of Kazan, Astrakhan and Siberia. He proclaims himself Tsar. The ambassadors come to him. He works alongside the chosen council, the elite, the highest aristocracy of the relatively young state that includes Sylvester, Adashev and Kurbsky. A lot of books are being published. Codes of law are being written. The diplomacy, army, and the administrative machinery all work fine. State revenue increases. This was a golden period for Russia. The only disturbing thing was the boyars' concealed resistance. They were destroying his proteges and giving orders of mass executions in the name of the Tsar. He needed a plan to tame the hated boyars. He thought about it day and night, until he was suddenly taken ill. For the second time in his life, death stared him in the face. Ivan started writing his will. He gathered the boyars and ordered them to swear loyally to his newborn son Dmitri. The boyars refused. They thought that the Tsar would not recover, and it was necessary to leave a free passage to the throne after his death. Unexpectedly, Sylvester also refused to swear loyalty to Ivan's son. He had a vision that soon the boy would die. Sick and tired of long negotiations with the boyars, the Tsar was frightened and then became furious. His spiritual mentor, the loyal Sylvester, acted together with the boyars. A foul traitor. The Tsar ordered the immediate seizure of the priest and his imprisonment in a remote monastery for the rest of his life. The boyars were taken aback by the Tsar's rage, so they accepted all his wishes. Ivan got his way. His 4-month-old son was recognized as his successor. Soon after, the Tsar made a surprising recovery. During his illness, Ivan swore to make a pilgrimage to holy places with his family in case of recovery. It's said that a well-known Orthodox enlightener, Maximus the Greek, tried to talk Ivan out of taking his 6-month-old son on such a long journey to avoid tragedy. But disappointed by Sylvester, the Tsar wouldn't listen to another prophet. Whilst boarding a boat for the river crossing, the bridge under the royal procession wobbled. The startled nanny let go of the prince, and he fell to the bottom of the river like a stone. In a moment, the bridge collapsed, and the Tsar, his wife and nanny found themselves in the icy water. After several dives, the royal heir was taken from the water. Ivan Vasilievich took the baby in his arms and, with tears, watched his son die. After his son's funeral, the Tsar started to think about the causes of the tragedy. The baby could not have been dropped intentionally. The nanny who carried him was supported by Tsarina Anastasia's brothers. But to make the bridge collapse was easy enough. Was that attempted murder? Probably. But who? The boyars, of course. Confident that his son had been killed by the boyars, the Tsar began brutal reprisals. He gave orders to arrest those who refused to swear loyalty to the prince and execute them in public as conspirators. Blinded by his own grief and revenge, he had chosen the most severe punishment. All 12 boyars were impaled. The news of the terrible boyar's death and Tsar's bloodthirstiness spread quickly. And talks about the Tsar's dethronement started again. Spontaneous riots began to break out, but the Tsar wasn't scared any longer. With the army's help, he could suppress any unrest. So Ivan Vasilievich didn't worry about the riots. At the same time, his beloved wife was dying of an unknown illness. She died quite young. From that moment on, Ivan Vasilievich changed. He was only 30 years old, but sufferings and anguish disfigured his face forever, turning him into an exhausted old man. In Moscow, there was even a rumor that the Tsar was replaced. He always kept his pain well hidden, sure that his wife had been poisoned. It was the boyar's revenge for the public execution. Ivan Vasilievich had not been mistaken. Gerasimov's group of anthropologists found in Tsarina Anastasia's remains large amounts of mercury. The same was true for his second wife, Caucasian Princess Maria Temryukovna, and also his third one, Marfa Sobakina. The boyars were poisoning Ivan the Terrible's wives and spreading rumors that the Tsar was killing them with his bare hands. The myth of the Black Widower was born. Its purpose was to scare people and raise them against the despot. To fight the boyars, it was not enough to accuse them of poisoning his wife. He had to prove that they were enemies of the people. At the time, all states' foreign policy was simple. Attack or you'll be attacked. To halt the aggression of neighbors, a country had to start a war with them. And back then, all wars needed considerable funds and the oligarchs' willingness to provide them. The Tsar suggested to the Boyars' Council a law to transfer the Boyars' lands to the state treasury. As expected, the Boyars' Council rejected the bill. This would be the last straw. The Boyars had not only betrayed the Tsar, but the interests of the state. On the 3rd of December 1564, a strange procession went out of the Kremlin gates. Sleighs carried royal processions and the Tsar himself out of the capital. And then the charter came. A royal herald proclaimed it from the squares of towns and cities for everybody to hear. The Tsar Ivan Vasilievich abdicated. Russia had never seen anything like it before. It was a brilliant tactical move. The Tsar warned that because of the Boyars' betrayals, people were to face brutal war and be treated like slaves under a foreign ruler. He sincerely repented of his sins, his weakness and inability to save people from the Boyars. He reminded them that he was God's vicar and his will was the will of God. People believed him. So what? All simple folks of Moscow, led by Metropolitan, asked him to return to Moscow, and he returned. The Tsar returned to Moscow and imposed a state of emergency and launched a giant repressive machine called Oprichnina. The Tsar formed the army of oprichniks from poor children of the nobility. He gave some land and gold from the treasury to each of them. Grateful to the monarch, oprichniks enthusiastically rushed to prove their loyalty. Their work was to learn about the slightest manifestations of dissatisfaction with the Tsar's policy and to punish rebellious boyars and their accomplices. Their emblem was a dog's head and a broom to sniff out treason and mercilessly sweep out the traitors. People were killed on the slightest suspicion or slander. The country was overrun with the guilty and innocent blood. The apotheosis was the massacre of Novgorod inhabitants, where the oprichniks discovered a plot. The local boyars decided to decoy Ivan Vasilievich in Novgorod, seize him and give him away to the Polish king. And in his place put Ivan's cousin, who was weak-willed and easily controlled by the boyars. The reaction of Tsar and his loyal oprichniks was terrible. More than 2,000 people were executed or tortured to death in Novgorod. Families were seized and tortured. The largest execution took place on the Volga River. Convicts were tied up and burned, and then, while still alive, were thrown into the water. Ivan himself came up with this punishment for a reason. In fact, during Ivan the Terrible's reign, people were expecting the end of the world. Chronicles report that the prophecies at the time foresaw the apocalypse as occurring in 70/70th. That is, in 1569 AD. 4 years before that date, the Tsar, using Oprichnina terror, tried to clear the country of the boyars. But as the fatal date approached, his unlimited power and religious fanaticism had created in Tsar's fevered imagination another idea. He was repeating, Tsar's will is God's will. And those who Tsar considers as sinners are sinners before God. And he, Ivan Vasilievich, has the right to punish them as God punishes at the Last Judgment. Once again, Ivan the Terrible was rereading the Apocalypse. For 4 years, he was punishing sinners, cleansing them before their death with fire and water, and then at night, he prayed for their sinful souls. But 70/70th passed, and the Last Judgment didn't come. Were the prophets wrong? Was it all in vain? Ivan Vasilievich was horrified. If so, then he is the greatest sinner. He must pray and ask God's forgiveness for having dared to equate himself with the Lord. Something desperate was awakening in him, a human despair. What have I done to this world? But the retribution that would come to the Tsar a year before his death would be almost worse than the Day of Judgment. With horror, Ivan watched his son's face turn into a deathly, impassive mask. It was the same as when his mother was dying. In his youth, he was holding the little Prince Dmitri. In his later years, he was at the deathbed of his beloved wife Anastasia. He was looking at his son Ivan and could do nothing. God was punishing him. He took away his pride and hope. The right to decide whether to live or die belongs only to him, the Lord. Where does this popular version of Ivan the Terrible killing his son with his staff come from? This legend was depicted by Ilya Repin in his painting, and he depicted it so realistically that women were fainting in front of it. Today, historians believe it was a rumor started by Antony Posavin, a Jesuit monk, who in 1581 came to Ivan the Terrible from Polish King Stefan Batory for truce talks. In the course of negotiations, the monk suddenly laid down a condition: to submit the Russian Church to the Pope. Ivan Vasilievich angrily refused and removed the monk from the chambers. After this, at the court of Batory and other European rulers, they started to talk about the cruel temper of the Russian Tsar. In a quarrel with his daughter-in-law, Ivan's wife, the prince stood up for her. And the Tsar hit him with a staff. Nothing else is known about his murder. The chronicles say that the prince died in a non-violent death, but the brutal version completed the image of a Tsar despot. It was hard not to believe it, because Ivan the Terrible openly blamed himself for his son's death. But obviously, he meant a different thing. Ivan the Terrible wanted to fall on his knees, but he couldn't. He was in severe pain. Even his body would not obey him. He had enraged God. He had gone too far. He had no right to decide who to punish and who to forgive. People's lives are not within his power. God showed him that by taking away his son. But he has two other successors, Fyodor and Dmitri. May God forgive him, cure Fyodor's madness and give long life to 10-year-old Dmitri. And he, the murderous Tsar, would always remember the names of all those he had condemned to death. He would spend all his money trying to save their souls. After his son's death, Ivan ordered to make the Synodic, a list of all the people who suffered during his reign. It meant their complete remission. Ivan the Terrible had made generous donations to the largest monasteries where monks were praying for the souls of these victims. Based on his commemoration list, the Tsar's victims numbered 3,000. He was 52, but the Tsar looked like an old man. His body was swelling from dropsy and rotting from the inside. No perfume could drown the stench of decay. A strong pain in his spine paralyzed his hands. He longed for death. He could no longer stand the physical sufferings and mental anguish, but his death was slow and painful. According to his last will before his death, he had been made a monk. To be honest, I think Ivan the Terrible was a victim of history, despite the incredible victims of his despotic acts. For a very simple reason. He was trying to create an integrated Russia, but through limitless violence. During the life of Ivan IV, no one called him Ivan the Terrible. This nickname appeared in folk songs much later. After the Tsar's death, the time of troubles began. At the beginning of the 17th century, the civil war took hundreds of thousands of lives. Ivan the Terrible's massacre of 3,000 victims pales in comparison. Ivan Vasilievich knew that he would not go to heaven. And he knew what hell was long before his death. When he realized that, he undertook the functions of God. Here was a man who forced all of Europe to its knees, ruthlessly massacring entire nations. His dream, to take over the world. His name was Attila. Attila lived as a king of a malicious tribe known as the Huns. During the 5th century AD, Attila was feared as death itself, called the Antichrist, and regarded as the devil in human form. During his lifetime, Attila never lost a single battle. Yet ironically, this warrior died quite by accident in the arms of a woman. What is amazing is that death overtook this brutal ruler of the Huns upon the joyous night of his wedding. And as a sign of mourning, every warrior of his tribe slashed their face, mourning their revered leader with tears of blood. His people could not understand why he died, for Attila had possessed a magic weapon, the sword of Ares, god of war. This sword was supposed to make him immortal. Byzantine scholar Priscus of Panium wrote in the chronicles of the 5th century, Attila had a magic weapon, the sword of God, and the one who owns it should become ruler of the world. If this sword really did exist, then why did it not save his master from this disgraceful death? We will unravel the mystery of Great Attila. We will soon find out whether the leader of the Huns actually owned this invincible weapon, and if so, what happened to the sword of the god Ares. Sword of God of War Ares. Every great warrior dreamed of finding it. This weapon is still amongst 10 of the most mysterious artifacts of the world, which includes the Spear of Odin, the Sword of King Arthur, the Holy Grail, and the Shield of Achilles. According to legend, God of War Ares offered his sword to the Scythians. With this gift, the steppe warriors became invincible. But one day, in a great battle, the sword of Ares was lost, only to be found again in the 5th century by a shepherd, who gave it to a barbarian warrior named Attila. The American Museum of Natural History, New York. As soon as the doors are shut, after the visitors have gone, all the exhibitions come alive in the dark rooms. Dinosaur skeletons and stuffed mammoths awaken, go wild through the corridors of the largest museum of America. All this is being watched by a terrified security guard who was recently hired for the job. As he tries to escape the mayhem, he suddenly runs into warlike people in skins. Their leader, with a wild roar, rushes into battle. A shaggy barbarian with the blunt face of an animal. This is how the king of the Huns, Attila, was portrayed by Sean Levy, the director of the movie The Night at the Museum. According to this movie plot, this great conqueror is a dumb beast, ready to mindlessly destroy every living thing in sight. Here, however, is how in the 5th century, Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus described the Huns. They are savage and ugly. At the very moment of birth, the chins, cheeks and faces of their infant children are deeply marked by an iron in order to stop the hair from growing. With terribly disfigured faces, they have strong bones and broad shoulders. They are so stout and clumsy that you could consider them two-legged beasts. This evidence has long been used by historians to describe Attila's army. Only when scholars studied the writings of those times has it become clear that the Roman chronicler had never in his lifetime seen the Huns, because he never traveled. His description was actually borrowed from his predecessor, who had described the Cimmerians in this way. If this description was only a bad rip-off, then what in fact did the Huns and their king Attila actually look like? Why did the most powerful countries of the world so fear and hate him? And what was the cause of this man's death, a monster-like character that his own people regarded a god, while the whole world regarded him as a punishment for Europe? During the migration period, a boy was born who would become the Antichrist, while gaining a force of many thousands, the army from hell. A man who would conquer all of Europe, destroying hundreds of cities without losing a single battle. Attila would spend his whole lifetime dreaming of capturing Rome. And to achieve this, he would be given the sword of the god of war, Ares. But one step away from this victory, right before he reached his dream of acquiring the gates of Rome, he would suddenly retreat and lose his power for good. Fifth century AD. During the migration period of nomadic tribes, a threat moves from Asia to Europe. These are the wild, barbaric tribes of the Huns, on a mission to conquer the world. And their base in Eastern Europe will become the south of the modern Ukraine and the Crimea. 1,500 years ago, the most horrific army in the world marched through these steppes. It was called the 11th biblical curse, or Devil's Army, destroying all living things. Their legendary campaign all began in this region of the Scythian steppes. At this time, Europe was inhabited by dozens of tribes. Living separately, the people were engaged in farming and raising livestock. Fighting was rare. The great Rome of Caesar's era had lost its power long before. The Holy Roman Empire was split into two parts, Western, with its capital in Rome, and Eastern, called the Byzantium. Weakened by internal rebellions and coups, they did not have the strength to protect themselves from external predators. Suddenly, without warning, the wild and brutal people of Asia arrived, barbarians known as the Huns. The Huns were a completely new phenomenon. This was a mobilized horde, cut off from their lands. Because this mass required new land to settle themselves, they were out to conquer. Crossing the sea, the Huns conquered the Crimea, then approached the borders of Italy and France. These were the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. The Romans feared the Huns, thus without struggle, agreed to cooperate, signing a peace agreement with their intruders. And so the Huns now became the new leaders and protectors of the Roman territory. For the promised security, they were paid regularly. Moreover, as Rome insisted, all Hun children born of royal bloodline must be separated from their parents to be raised in Rome. These future kings became accustomed to luxury and depravity, and gradually they were turned not into warriors, but into drunkards and idlers. Finally, when returned to their own tribe, these worthless leaders were not able to fight and thus not dangerous to the Romans. In a single day, all this changed. When crossing a river with his men, the wife of new king of the Huns, Munzak, went into labor. His horses barely made it to the bank. With carts still submerged in water, Munzak's wife gave birth to a baby boy. The young prince was named Attila. However, Munzak already had a son, Bleda. What the king could not have foretold was that one day this young baby would cruelly murder his older brother and then force Europe to its knees. At first, the king ordered the newborn to be separated from its mother. Women in a Hun army had no authority to raise a boy and future warrior. This is what had been done to eldest son Bleda. Separated from his mother at birth, the child was seized and sent to Rome. However, it was different with Attila. In spite of the agreement with Rome, his father decided to leave the boy in Hun hands with the army. Cruel military rearing of the Huns awaited him. With his own eyes, the child would witness his fellow tribesmen slaughtering their enemies in cold blood. And at an unusually early age, he rid himself of his fears. Attila learned early what death is in his father's arms. The Huns didn't break the agreement of protection with the Romans, but fought constantly with its neighboring tribes. These became brutal warriors. Little Attila saw, with his own eyes, gruesome deaths and annihilation. However, this was not strange to him. He swiftly mastered the art of combat and became insensitive to pain. The child, who began fighting from infancy, taking part in military maneuvers, watched the onslaughts of injuries, deaths, and the military passions of soldiers who started fights and survived. He regarded this his life. Most likely, he thought in terms of the strategies involved in war. This seemed perfectly normal. When turning 10, Attila became classed as a man. This meant he would have to pass a test in order to confirm his new status. No longer a boy, but a warrior. This test had one requirement: remain planted on a horse for 14 days. When the great day came, Attila mounted his horse. Constantly watched by nearby guards, a horseman was brought food but not allowed to get off his horse for a moment. Neither to sleep, eat, nor satisfy mental needs. Everything had to be done mounted on horseback. What kind of man is capable of staying on horseback for 2 weeks straight? To understand what this boy must have endured, we will conduct our own experiment. We will spend at least one day on the back of a horse. To begin with, we will explain how to stay in a saddle and get a horse to obey. First, let's note the time. An hour later in the saddle. Fatigue begins to appear. It's also not at all comfortable to eat. Letting go of the reins, you can see the horse wants to start moving. 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours later, you start to hate the horse. Your energy is sapped. To endure more than 12 hours on horseback, first, you need to be in good physical shape. Now I'm starting to feel some pain in my legs, and of course from permanent sitting. Severe pain in my back. I haven't slept, but I think if I was deathly exhausted and the horse was still enough, I might possibly be able to have a doze. However, this young boy named Attila managed to accomplish this feat. Now he could be an equal with other soldiers. His father would be proud of him. But when he was allowed to get off his horse, it is likely he just let go of the reins and fell to the ground. This arduous experience would prove not to be in vain for the boy, because when the time came, the grueling test would not allow him to give in, but he would be filled with hatred. which eventually would burn half the world. It is known that in ancient times, the inhabitants of ancient Sparta were raising their citizens as warriors. There, a child under 7 years lived with his mother in Gynaecium and was filled with her maternal love. Once reaching this age, we believe he would have obtained some humanistic qualities. We must understand that this is a kid that grew up without a mother. His formative years were spent without affection, and so he was totally alien to the idea of being tender or gentle. The only person in this world that Attila loved was his father. Attila stood proudly next to his father in every battle, and the king Munzak knew without a doubt that it should be the younger son that was not surrendered to the Romans, and not his eldest child, who should be his real successor. And so he would command Attila, and not his brother, to lead the army after his death. However, the king had no time to give this order. At the age of 12, Attila lost his father, fatally wounded in battle. King Munzak died during the night. That morning, Attila awoke, both an orphan and as the new king. So thought the army, and so thought Attila, but he missed one piece of the puzzle. His father had a brother named Rua. Cunning and depraved, this uncle managed to make plans behind the king's back with Attila's older brother, Bleda. Attila was simply betrayed by his brother and his uncle. The boy awoke one morning before dawn. In a dream, he had witnessed his father, bloodstained. The older man wanted to explain something, wanted to warn his son. But suddenly, the boy felt someone in the tent. Strong hands hurled him from the bed, and a hard blow to the head plunged him into darkness. As Attila came to his senses, he discovered he was suddenly far from his home, bound like a wild animal. He learned he had been secretly smuggled into Rome. This was a conspiracy by the Roman emperor and his uncle. After kidnapping the rightful heir to the throne, Rua proclaimed himself king of the Huns. Rua could not kill his nephew. Fearful of an uprising, in order to effectively seize away the power, he made plans to send the boy away. This would prevent any problems with his takeover. He next enlisted the assistance of Attila's brother, Bleda, persuading him with the promise of unlimited power and support. While Attila was in Rome, Bleda became a puppet. Attila was released from his ropes in a magnificent palace, and only then was it explained to him why he was there. It was on the orders of his uncle. The boy turned pale with anger. There would have been strong nationalistic emotion proliferating the indigenous Romans' mind, a certain superiority that caused the native-born persons to regard themselves as Romans by birth, while all other sects were believed to be almost subhuman. It's more than likely that this sort of prejudice was directed at Attila as well, alienating him from the rest. The intolerance dug deep into Attila's soul, in such a way that later, every aspect of civilization, and all that related to it, reminded him and repelled him. Attila attempted to escape 3 times. However, the heavy security and high walls of the city didn't allow him to succeed. With each narrow escape, he was captured and returned. Time went on. A year passed. Attila's outer spirit became worn. He became quiet, subdued. Yet in the lower reaches of Attila's soul, an uncontrollable savagery boiled. To pass the time, Attila took to his studies, mastering grammar and learning to read and count. He focused closely on the system of the Roman army, examining military equipment, learning about the cavalry and about military discipline. Nobody could have imagined just how cunning this man was beneath that quiet exterior. Beneath it all, Attila had not forgotten the insults. He vowed he would kill his uncle and all associated, and he would punish his brother for his treason. And then, he would come back to this place and level the whole damn city. Attila lived alone with his thoughts in Rome captivity for 8 years. He finally seized a chance. Meanwhile, his uncle died unexpectedly. The Huns now demanded the return of their rightful heir. The day that Attila the Hun left behind the gates of Rome became the beginning of the end of the great empire. Attila arrived home a different person, now mature and fierce. He hadn't seen his fellow tribesmen for 8 years, and during that time, the army of the Huns had changed. Nothing remained left of the once powerful army. During his forced exile, the great tribe of the Huns lost its militancy. There was no one left to lead the warriors into campaigns. They had forgotten their drills, ate voraciously and drank even more. The Huns had become apathetic under their new leader, King Bleda. And Bleda was not at all amused by his military affairs, captivated instead by the entertainment he loved so much while in Rome. His younger brother, so unlike Bleda, reminded him of a savage. After the coronation of the prince, Bleda simply handed over the army to his returning brother, since it was useless to him. Attila couldn't have asked for more. For many years, Attila reared in himself iron and intense brutality. All this helped him turn his tribe back into a strong army once again. Attila gradually managed to conquer and unite the neighboring countries, drawing them under one single flag, so that he now had the army of 100,000. However, his only plan was for revenge. His revenge involved the conquest of Rome. Wild, primitive barbarians, people who wear skins of dead animals and eat raw meat. This was how Europe saw them. Attila led a now strong army into Europe and caused panic among the civilized people. However, despite Attila's leadership, all the gold and glory seized during the campaigns were handed over to Attila's older brother. Bleda the king couldn't care less about war with Rome. Meanwhile, for Attila, the destruction of this powerful city would make his life complete. Moreover, he desired sole power and public worship. As a person deprived of a mother in early childhood, Attila was brought up as well by a cool, oppressive father. Maybe you would call him doting, kissing and tossing him up in the air while saying, "Well, my boy, do you like that I've just killed 10,000 people for you?" Well, I doubt it, but either way, Attila turned strict and harsh. If a man cannot love anyone, he always needs to prove to himself and others that he exists. Thus far, Attila didn't dare remove his brother. It could split the country down the middle. However, a miracle helped him carry out his plan. One day, Attila got off his horse in a clearing in the woods. He sent the guards away, lied down in the tall grass, and fell asleep. He was awakened by a shepherd. Handing Attila a package of coarse cloth, the shepherd told him one of the cows in his herd had fallen down dead. Having discovered on her leg a terrible wound, the shepherd followed the bloody trail and not far away on the ground spotted a shiny blade. It was a sword that killed the cow with just a mere touch. The shepherd decided that he must give this powerful weapon to a great warrior. When Attila unfolded the cloth, his mouth dropped. In his grasp, an iron sword, the weapon of the god of war himself, the sword of Ares. This was a magical weapon, created and given to the fearless Scythians long ago by the god himself. As it was told in the legend, while the Scythians held the sword, they became invincible in battle. However, during a terrible battle, this sword had got lost. Attila knew of this legend and knew that a warrior with a magic sword could conquer the world and become immortal. This was exactly what Attila needed. He realized how to use the legend and the story of the shepherd, despite the fact he was holding a simple iron sword. An ordinary Scythian sword. It brought Attila an insight and prompted his decision to carry out a little ambitious PR move. This piece of iron would make him God's chosen one, and he was sure he would manage to convince everyone that this was the sword of the god Ares. But why had Attila deceived his men? Historians say it was a false information campaign which led to surprising results. Attila had a powerful army. And to intimidate the world and add political weight to the Huns, he needed a myth. He simply came up with a story that he had found the sword of the god Ares, which could belong only to the chosen one. Since Attila was preparing for war, the discovery of such a sword has been interpreted by shamans as a symbol of victory. This was what he told his army: they would win. Shamans had said it, and the gods confirmed it. This could be nothing less than a good sign, a stroke of luck, because the Huns, like other Turks at that time, were shamanists, and accordingly, they believed in superstitious things. Attila had found this victorious sword of the god of war. The news spread throughout the world like wildfire. In a rush, neighboring countries prepared their armies to meet the undefeated fighter. And Attila himself hastened to the camp of his brother. There, in honor of the great event, were organized celebrations. Attila was sitting next to Bleda, the king. His drunken brother glanced over in merriment. Suddenly, Attila stood up, raised his sword. With eyes icy and revolting, like the god of war himself, Attila pierced the chest of his sibling with his sword. At this moment, laughter of drunken soldiers died away, as Bleda lay dying. He glanced around at those present, his eyes seared as he coldly, calmly wiped his sword and sat down again. No one dared to stand up, and so Attila became the sole ruler of the Huns. After killing his brother, the king confirmed that he is no longer simply a man. Attila had found the sword of Ares, and he became the ruler of the world, cold and ruthless as Ares himself. Since that day, the new Attila began to gather a massive army. His ultimate goal, still, his much-hated Rome. But he would not destroy this city at once. He would frighten them and make the Romans shudder. Therefore, the first city in his war strategy was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. As the army of Attila approached the Byzantine Empire, the emperor of that territory didn't bother to advance his army to meet them. He was frightfully scared. Therefore, he paid the Huns their desired ransom in gold. The first victory was an easy one. Attila returned home in triumph and glory, with hundreds of women flocking around him after the campaign. These, astoundingly, were all considered his legitimate wives. Over the earlier years of his campaigns, Attila didn't waste time. He conquered town or village, destroyed its inhabitants, and declared the most beautiful women his wives. Due to his bravado and confidence, these women readily succumbed to their fate. A record of his polygamy was left by Byzantine philosopher Priscus of Panium. He witnessed himself the joyful meeting of Attila with his wives. Priscus of Panium, the chronicler, was surprised by the leader's charisma. After all, Attila was plain, short, and ugly, with a sparse beard and beady eyes. But despite this, he was horrendously successful with women. By the way, even the most famous womanizer, Vladimir the Grand, Prince of Kievan Rus, didn't manage to surpass this great Hun in offspring. Vladimir had only 700 children. It's hard to believe, but by comparison, Attila had more than 1,000. Attila got used to taking everything by force. Conquering one new land after another, he chose the cream of the crop in women. But he couldn't have known that one of them would not submit to her fate, bringing certain death to her husband. And it would happen on their wedding night. At last, the moment of revenge. Attila would finally take on his former prison, Rome, the Army of Darkness. This was the name bestowed the army of 700,000 Huns by the panicked Europeans as they approached the borders of the empire. Advancing from the sides of the defenders, Roman legions equal in force, the two armies met face to face along the French landscape, an area called Catalaunian Fields. It was here that one of the bloodiest battles in history took place. with massacres continuing for 7 days. During this time, the fields turned black with corpses and the Huns prevailed. A total of 150,000 lives were lost in battle. This was the price of that ticket to Rome for Attila. After winning at Catalonia, the army of barbarians speedily penetrated into Europe. Journeying 2,000 kilometers on horseback, and on the way destroying towns and massacring its inhabitants, not a soul would be spared. No women, no children. The approaching horsemen were like an apocalypse machine, full of barbarian devil beasts led by the Antichrist himself. And if the army of hell conquered Rome, it would mean the end of the world. Attila was pleased by the terror. Finally, he had earned his merit. Feared and worshipped by everyone like a god of war. However, on the way to Rome, the Hun troops decided to stop in the small country of Burgundy. It was a region inhabited by ancient Scandinavians and Germans. The country was ruled by the young King Gunther, who had one beloved sister, Princess Kriemhild. The princess's beauty charmed the richest emperors of the world. After many requests for marriage and many refusals, she chose a husband. She prepared for a great wedding, and at this time, the army of Attila approached Burgundy. The leader of the Huns had heard of the wayward princess. Thus, he decided to take for himself the king's most valuable asset, not gold, but Gunther's lovely sister. He decided he would tame Kriemhild like an obstinate horse. However, on request, Kriemhild and her brother directly refused his offer. Feeling like lightning struck his vanity, the invading king decided to avenge violently. Burgundy was razed in a single night. Attila, with his own hand, murdered Gunther along with Kriemhild's fiancé, then dragged the princess out of her chambers by her hair. He would not kill her, but decided to marry her and take her by force. And then she would be sorry for her refusal. Kriemhild, however, had other intentions. After all, she had nothing else to lose. She would see to it that Attila would regret destroying her life, even though everyone claimed that he was immortal. It finally happened. After destroying half of Europe, Attila's army surrounded Rome. The leader of the Huns gazed silently at his former prison. For a moment, he was an offended boy all over again, betrayed and brought here against his will. He would make one last order: wipe out and destroy all the inhabitants of this depraved city. Suddenly, he spotted another procession. Coming towards the army of the Huns, a man walking fearlessly fronted this parade, and he was draped in a long red gown. It was Pope Leo I. On seeing the holy man, cruel Attila stopped short and signaled the guards to hold, then alone went to meet him. The conversation of Attila and the Pope is still one of the greatest mysteries in history. Today, we can only guess what the Pope reproached the King of the Huns with. Perhaps he knew him as a boy. Perhaps he even taught him before he became the Pope. And perhaps it was Leo I who unraveled the secret of Attila's sword, and he knew that in fact, beneath his cruelty, the man brought up under Rome's dominion was hiding a silent weakness. Attila wasn't a fearless person. He wasn't fearless, you see. He wanted to give the impression of being fearless, and that's why he wasn't fearless. Because a man wants to seem like something only if he knows that, in fact, he is not like that. What the Pope said to the most brutal leader of the barbarians is still unknown. The conversation lasted over an hour. Once finished, Attila did something completely unexpected. Attila, this nightmare of Europe and Antichrist, simply turned his army around and left. It was the only defeat of the King of the Huns, and it became fatal for him. At that moment, nobody dared accuse the king, but the Huns did not understand his action. After this, silent rumors spread throughout his army. Attila had lost his divine power. The god of war cast the Huns to their fate. The army returned home for the first time, not in triumph, but with a very sour aftertaste. To distract the soldiers, Attila ordered to arrange a sumptuous feast. And there was a reason: his next marriage with his captive beauty, Kriemhild. He always behaved like a naughty child. I get everything I want. How would we treat a child when it behaves hysterically? The mother cuddles it near, but no one could cuddle Attila. Therefore, he got accustomed to the attitude, as I want, as I say, so it will be. The wedding lasted until late at night, and then, under the shouts of drunken soldiers, Attila and his bride were walked to their chambers. Several hours passed, and suddenly the palace shuddered with an inhuman cry. It was the cry of immortal Attila. Coming up, what happened on that night? What did undefeated Attila, the great conqueror who put half the world on its knees, die of? And finally, what did the Huns invent to hide the disgrace of their lord for good? He had extraordinary power given to him by the great sword of the god of war, Ares. Attila lived for more than 50 years, never losing a single battle, conquering all of Europe. For his extreme brutality, he was called the Antichrist, scourge of God, a terrible punishment that would destroy the world. All his life, he had been dreaming of the one moment that he would conquer Rome. But when his force of many thousands came upon Rome, he retreated mysteriously. But on his return home, there came a startling end to his reign of terror. Invincible Attila found his fate in the arms of his wife. When they heard the cry, the guards burst into his room and saw the king motionless. Pinned under him, his blood-stained young wife, desperately trying to wriggle herself free. There was no need to look for the killer because Kriemhild made no secret of her revenge. But what could Attila have died of? Researchers suggest that this was a meaningless death, a coincidence. On that evening, Attila actually just drank too much, and his blood pressure rose. The king allegedly choked on his own blood, and it shot out of his nose. Doctors say that in fact, alcohol consumption raises blood pressure. The pressure on the vessels increases, the blood begins to circulate through the body more quickly, and heart rate also increases. Weak blood vessels of the nose often break, and a person can choke with blood in their sleep. However, ancient historians insist that Attila died instantly. He simply couldn't have choked on his blood. Thousands of people wanted him dead, but most of all, one woman, Kriemhild. The Burgundian princess had opportunity to kill herself in captivity, but did not. Her strength was supported by only one thing: the desire for revenge. By killing two people very close to her, Attila, without knowing it, was doomed to a terrible death. Ancient people had completely different attitudes towards death. Apparently, she was not a quiet flower, some sort of lily of the valley or forget-me-not. She avenged, and she avenged with pleasure. She didn't want to deprive herself of further pleasure to look at the dead body of her tormentor. The method she had chosen is unknown. It wasn't a knife. It is assumed that Attila was murdered with an unknown poison. Kriemhild had been keeping it for months until she got a chance to use it. Thus, this woman had done something that fearless men were unable to accomplish. Not only did she murder, but also had disgraced the most terrible man of that period, although she knew very well what punishment awaited her. In despair, the Huns cut their faces so that blood could be viewed as shed for their great king, while hiding the weakness of tears. And they avenged the wife of Attila for the disgrace of their king. Kriemhild was buried next to her much-hated husband, alive along with the dead. Attila's funeral lasted for several days. and so that no one would ever disturb his tomb, the king was buried in 3 coffins. In an iron one, because he conquered people, a silver one, and finally in a gold one, as a symbol of tribute to honor Attila, leader of the most powerful empire. All of these 3 coffins were shut tight with locks and spells, and no mortal has ever been able to open them. So that Attila's ashes would not be bothered by any mortal, the king's grave was dug at the bottom of a deep river. To do this, the Huns constructed a dike to alter the direction of the water flow during the funeral. It's hard to imagine that in those days, without any equipment, they actually managed to do it. When the funeral ended, the grave was filled up, the river was once again returned to its bed, and the slaves that dug the hole were killed the same night, so that no one would ever reveal the secret of his burial. As legend has it, this place is protected by forces from the beyond. Anyone who dares to open this tomb will summon up the curse of the human race. Desecration of sacred kings' graves could always bring misfortune to people. Therefore, it was necessary to hide it, not only for utilitarian purposes, in order to protect it from being robbed, but in addition, so that this tomb would not be desecrated. The river that hides the precious tomb of Attila has been searched for 15 centuries. But ancient historians who wrote about the amazing life of Attila do not specify the sacred spot of his burial. Along with the tomb disappeared the magical sword of Attila. The tribe of the Huns had lost their good luck forever. The fact is, Attila the Hun was a successful military leader who conquered, if not all of Europe, then at least half. While his army enjoyed the fruits of their victories, robbery, rape and violence, no one could stop them. But stumble once, and your recognition reverts from good to bad. Military luck vanishes easily. This reveals that no matter how big the gang gathered around a teenager, they will scatter at the first opportunity. Therefore, the kingdom of Attila didn't last indefinitely. A few years after the death of the invincible king of the Huns, his state disappeared from the map of the world for good. The descendants of the great Attila ultimately settled in the Caucasus, in the territories of Ukraine and Slovakia. The entire world still perceives Attila as a savage and barbarian. But for the modern Hungarians, he has become a national hero, the father and founder of a country. Presently, the Hungarians are going to spend $1 million to restore Attila's palace. What's more, they still hope to locate his tomb, despite the fact there are many speculations of its whereabouts. As historians search for the priceless tomb in places like the Hungarian river Tisa or in the Russian Volga River, even in the lakes of the Caucasus, according to historic research, Attila could have lived for some time in modern Ukraine. Therefore, it is quite possible that he was buried at the mouth of the Danube in the Ukraine. However, in order to test such an assumption, he must again, like 15 centuries ago, stop a river. Which one? This is still unknown. And this is why the world's master and leader of the vanished empire is still securely being guarded by impetuous waters of an unknown river. Along with his missing body lies the mystery of Attila, the man-god who successfully conquered the entire world while devoting his life to vengeance, and then lost his life to vengeance. He should not become a ruler, and he would never become a tyrant. The only prophecy attributed to a young boy named Joseph Jugashvili was accidental death in young childhood, but owing to unbelievable circumstances, he survived. As gratitude to God for his salvation, he graduated from a religious school and entered a theological seminary. He planned to be a priest until he met a man who changed his life. After that meeting, he changed his name and date of birth. He started to lead a double life. Soon the world would know him under the name of Stalin, literally meaning a man made of steel, a cruel ruler deprived of emotions and feelings. Only a few friends would remember the old Joseph, a timid and shy boy from the town of Gori. What happened to that boy after the tragic accident in Gori? Who made him change? And why did a shy seminarist turn into a bloody murderer and despot? You will uncover the secrets of Joseph Jugashvili, the secrets which, if disclosed, could lead to the death sentence. You will see 2 horoscopes of Josef Stalin and hear a sensational discovery made by astrologists based on the ruler's death mask.
Тот образ вождя, который нам внушали с детства, этой маской сразу разрушается.
It happened in 1890 in a small town of Gori in Georgia. A choir of boys were singing a canticle on the street. A phaeton was approaching. Suddenly, the horse jerked at its reins and neighed. It happened so quickly that the children and their teacher didn't understand what was going on. The horse galloped towards the singing boys. They all ran away, except for 12-year-old Soso. The horse kicked Soso over. Soso appeared to be dead. If the horse had kicked Soso in the head, it could have changed the history of the Soviet Union forever. The 12-year-old could have died under the phaeton's wheels, or he could have died of smallpox when he was 5. He could have died before his first birthday, just like his brothers. But he was destined to live a long life. For a small Georgian boy, Gori was a god-forsaken town. The son of a shoemaker and a laundress, he would go on to become the leader of the largest country on earth. He would be known to the world as Josef Stalin. In 1932, Soviet newspapers remembered that accident in Gori and, furthermore, published an interview with Stalin's mother. In that interview, she told of how her child Soso had been a very sickly, timid boy. Finally, she admitted it would have been better if he'd become a priest. Stalin could hardly contain his anger. It took him 30 years to gain absolute power. For 10 years, he held power in his hands, but was surrounded by enemies who raked through his past, trying to find some compromising information that would destroy him. But they would fail. The same day, the Politburo of the Central Committee, governing body of the Communist Party, received an angry letter saying, "Avoid any new interviews with my mother and any other unnecessary publicity into our newspapers. Spare me those scoundrels' search for sensations." Until Stalin's death, his official biography contained only 3 phrases. Born in Gori, commenced revolutionary fight at the age of 15, headed the party and the state after Lenin's death. Stalin suppressed any attempts to shed light on his youth. What was the people's father hiding? A strong kick, no internal damages. A doctor prescribed rest and a good diet. Ekaterina Jugashvili, or Keke as she was known by her neighbors and relatives, shed bitter tears over her son. How could her only son die from a horse kick? Keke leant over the boy. God, why do you make him suffer so? A doctor said, good diet. Where do I get the money? My husband will come soon, drunk and impoverished. Besso, the shoemaker, always spends everything he earns in the pub. He doesn't care about his crippled son. Once the kid almost died because of his father. The tragedy happened when Joseph had just celebrated his 6th birthday. Keke worked as a laundress at the house of a wealthy wine merchant. From morning till night, she rinsed linen in the ice-cold waters of Kura, and at night, she darned the merchant's shirts. Her husband, Vissarion, Besso, made shirts during the day, and in the evening, wasted his money in the pub. Sosso was left alone and begged God not to allow night to return. For at around midnight every night, his father would come back from the pub, and all hell would break out. However, that night, Vissarion came earlier than usual. His wife put supper on the table and quickly returned to her sewing work. This made her husband angry. How humiliating! She should stand at his side while he is eating. Vissarion rushed over to his wife and started beating her. Sosso, in an attempt to protect his mother, rushed over to his father. But his father grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the floor before kicking him hard. Hearing Keke's awful cries, the neighbors rushed over and tied the hooligan up. 2 weeks later, Sosso found blood in his urine. The father had damaged his kidney. Vissarion Djugashvili drank hard. He often came home without his belt, the last thing for a Georgian to do. What was going on in his soul? What grief was he trying to drown in wine? Why did he vent his spleen upon his only son and wife? No one will ever know. In an attempt to explain those fits of anger, some biographers of Stalin have suggested that Besso the shoemaker took revenge on his wife and hated his son because he was not the real father. Since Stalin's death, several possible real fathers have come to light. However, only 2 of them were the focus of rumor.
В нынешнем городе Горе, несмотря на то, что там почитает Сталин, там все убеждены, что настоящим отцом Сталина был Игнаташвили, купец тамошний.
Iakov Ignatashvili was a rich wine merchant. Keke worked for him. He took pity on the mother and son and often helped them with money and food. And later, he paid for Sosso's studies at the Gori Theological School. This financial support is confirmed in the memoirs of Stalin's mother. They were found recently in the state archives of Georgia. That generosity can hardly be deemed a confirmation of a relationship between the master and his laundress. There is evidence that Iakov Ignatashvili was just a very kind and sentimental person. He did not have his own children, and that's why he helped the children of others. But humans always remain human. There were so-called well-wishers in Gori who told Vissarion that the master of charity had other motives. And he tormented his wife with jealousy. Young Joseph heard it all. What was he able to understand at the time? The older he became, the more contempt he felt towards his mother.
Что касается матери Сталина, потому как Сталин к ней относился, можно предположить, что он считал себя действительно ублюдком, бастардом. Сами по себе слухи о том, что он незаконно рожден, его, конечно, травмировали. Детскую, юношескую психику такие вещи очень сильно травмировали.
There is evidence from one of Stalin's contemporaries that once during a conversation he called his mother a whore. Was this bitter conclusion based on his childhood experience? It's unlikely. Usually, people keep such thoughts to themselves, especially lonely, selfish people like Stalin. It means that this confession, which seemed so sincere, was for some reason beneficial. But why? He wanted those rumors about it. A supposition that Stalin's real father was a well-known Russian traveler named Przhevalsky was on everybody's lips. Back then, people could be wiped off the face of the earth for being rude about Stalin. It looks as though Stalin wanted to turn those rumors to his benefit. The Tsar of the huge empire, with Russians as the dominating nation, preferred that his father be an outstanding Russian scientist than a Georgian drunk. Except for the likeness in appearance, there are no other confirmations that Przhevalsky was Stalin's father. Stalin's temper does not leave any room for doubt. Besso the irresolute, revengeful, despotic shoemaker can be clearly seen in Stalin. He hated his father and was ashamed of him. But with age, he became increasingly like his father. The day the boy was hit by a phaeton, his mother felt shock. She urgently needed money. She went to the man who never helped her, to Ignatashvili the merchant. He expressed sympathy for her and generously gave her money to buy medicines and food for the child. Keke prudently divided the money into several portions and hid them so that her drunkard husband could not find them. Next day, she saw that the hiding place had been discovered and that the money was gone. That evening, Besso, drunk as usual, returned home. His wife rushed over to him and asked where the money was. Besso's eyes became bloodshot. He demanded to know where she had got the money. Keke had to confess. He behaved as though he'd caught her cheating. Besso rushed at her. Soso grabbed a knife and threw it at his father's back. But he missed. He assumed his father would kill him. But instead, Besso took the knife and asked, "Could you really kill me, son?" And in his eyes, he read, "Yes." Several years later, a book by a Georgian writer Kazbeki titled Patricide would get into Joseph's hand. One of the book's heroes, a noble robber and people's venger, would leave a lasting impression. His name was Koba. Later, a young revolutionary, Joseph Jugashvili, would take it as his nickname. Soso will never forget the day when he laid his hands on his father. He felt a sense of satisfaction. Those offenses could not be forgiven. They needed to be avenged. A single occurrence at the theological school where he studied convinced him that this conclusion was right. Coming soon, Stalin's hidden defect. Why didn't he take his shoes off in the presence of strangers? A bloody revenge upon a betrayer friend. How an executioner was born. Gurdjieff, the occultist. A life-changing prophecy for a theological school student, Stalin. Why did Stalin change his date of birth? An unbelievable discovery using a death mask. Pious Keke believed that becoming a priest would be the most worthy career for her only son. When Soso entered the Gori Theological School, she was overjoyed. She didn't realize that Joseph had only chosen to become a priest to annoy his father. Vissarion wanted Soso to become a shoemaker because he believed he was stupid. On hearing this, 9-year-old Soso went crazy and resolved to prove that he had talent. He would get a degree and become a priest. He would become a metropolitan and then a patriarch. His father would regret what he had said. Soso became a clever, diligent student. Teachers said only good things about him. This boosted his self-esteem. Initially unsociable and taciturn, he began to take part in school activities, and soon he made a real friend. Soso loved him with all his heart. He had never had any friends. He was glad that finally there was someone to talk to and to share his thoughts. It was to this boy
Иосиф Джугашвили с неохотой снимает обувь, как-то над ним слегка пошутил, говорит: «Ты что, у тебя там скрывается дьявольская копытца?»
Soso stiffened. Who said that? He could not believe his ears. He recognized the voice of his friend. Let's take his shoes off. You'll see it with your own eyes.
Сосо не встиг зреагувати.
Soso's reaction slowed down. This psychological feature of stiffening in critical situations first manifested itself during the accident with the phaeton. All the children scattered in different directions. Joseph was so scared he couldn't move. As a result, he was severely injured. He had the same reaction in June of 1941. The news that the war had broken out shocked Stalin so much that he became utterly speechless and hid himself away at his summer house. Molotov had to announce a general mobilization. Only 10 days later, Stalin, emaciated and wizened, would find the strength to make a speech to his people. He couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed his will. His schoolmates knocked him to the ground and started to take off his shoes. He fought back, but it was an uneven confrontation. Fortunately, the teacher stepped in. Joseph was left alone. He wiped away the tears of humiliation while his former friend was jeering at him, just like the others. "Devil, we will bring you out into the open." Stalin's medical card says, "webbing of fingers on left foot." The nature of that mutilation is unknown. It may be the consequence of the accident with the phaeton, since witnesses said the phaeton ran over the boy's feet. On the other hand, it may be a congenital defect, which is common for children of alcoholics. This defect has a very unpleasant name, devil's hoof. Soso felt shy because of it and hid the defect. The only person to whom Soso entrusted his secret was that boy who organized the persecution on the riverbank. They were in the bathhouse, and Joseph showed him the mutilation. He was Soso's friend and promised him to keep it a secret. In the end, he betrayed him and tried to dishonor him in front of the others. That accident changed his attitude towards people for the rest of his life. Trust no one, since even a friend may betray you. He never made another friend. There were some acquaintances whom he used. There were comrades. But he carefully locked all his secrets and personal worries deep inside his soul. After the accident, Soso longed for revenge. The betrayer must regret what he had done. Josef Djugashvili did not forgive offenses and humiliations. After the incident, Soso became friends with the toughest boy in the school, whose name was Zaradze. Several months later, Zaradze, on Soso's order, attacked the betrayer. Soso watched the boys fight, but did not join in. He felt satisfaction watching his one-time friend writhing in pain, especially when he started begging for mercy. He felt power over another human being for the first time. He was the only one who could decide whether the offender should live or die. A thought flickered through his head. The betrayer should die. The victim wheezed and choked with blood. Suddenly, Joseph saw a teacher running to them and told Zaradze to stop the execution. After the beating, the victim was sent to hospital, where doctors claimed that it was pure chance that the boy had survived. The incident was reviewed by the administrative board of the school. Joseph was scared, since punishment looked inevitable. In the end, the hired executioner, Zaradze, was expelled, and Soso was left alone. After all, he was the best student and had not actually taken part in the violence. When everything was over, Joseph breathed a sigh of relief. He realized that revenge should be carried out by others. It was not so sweet, but much safer. Many years later, he would use this principle to build a powerful machinery of repression. The effect would be astonishing. For a long time after dethronement of the personality cult, people would say, the blood of millions is on the hands of Eshov, Beria, and others. And Stalin, as a kind of czar, did not know anything, and hence was not guilty. Joseph graduated from the theological school with honors. He passed with an excellent Mark 10 out of 12 examination disciplines. The diploma allowed him to continue studies at the Tiflis Theological Seminary. Furthermore, as the best graduate, Josef Djugashvili was exempt from paying for his education, and the government paid for it. His mother was happy. Her dream had come true. Her son would make a career in the church, and then everything in his life would be perfect. Let God give her the chance to stay alive till that moment. Joseph listened to his mother and thought of the event that had shattered his belief in God. He couldn't tell Keke about that because he himself was afraid to admit it, but the recollection of that event did not leave him. When he was in the second form at school, he and his friends saw a public execution for the first time. Their teacher had taken them there to show where sinners end their days, at the gibbet. But the 12-year-old teenagers were depressed by what they saw. Their minds could not match the commandment, "Do not kill," which was preached at school, with the execution of 2 peasants. Especially as during one of the executions, a rope broke. At that moment, Soso breathed a sigh of relief. There is an unwritten rule that no one could be executed twice. But then he looked on with astonishment. The rope was replaced. The priest on the scaffold turned away indifferently, and the peasant was hanged. When the shock was over, Soso believed that he had been fooled at the theological school. In real life, common people and even priests breach God's commandments. After graduation, he reached a crossroads. He longed to leave Gori and enter to a big, wide world in order to change his fate. But he was eaten up with doubt. He did not see why he should have to enter the church. He had nothing to prove to his father any longer. Several years had passed since Vissarion Djugashvili was killed for his debts in the pub. Should he become a seminary student for the sake of the mother? She would be glad. She believed that sooner or later her son would make his way to the top of the church hierarchy. She didn't ask whether his faith was strong or whether he was worthy of such a reward. Suddenly, Joseph understood. It was not faith that mattered, but power. He would be worshipped. He would be respected. He could remit sins or impose punishments. He would be like a god on earth. As for his doubts, should it not be seminary's job to strengthen his belief in God? He suffered. Everything turned out to be different from what he expected it to be. The strictest regime was established at the seminary. Endless church services, studies, prayers, a 2-hour walk around the town, and prayers again. At 10 in the evening, candles were put out and the seminary was plunged into a deep sleep. Time after time, Joseph regretted his decision to continue his studies. In that semi-prison atmosphere, dreams about his forthcoming career and his future grandeur looked unrealistic. He felt like an innocent prisoner. He was 17 and in despair. Recently, he read a book by Darwin, Origin of Species, and made the final conclusion that they were deceived at the seminary. God did not exist. But what did exist? What should he believe in and strive for? His eyes were opened when a student friend from a senior course showed him a shabby book titled Revolutionary's Catechism, saying it contained the answer to Joseph's questions. However, he warned that the book was forbidden and one could be expelled or even put into jail for having it. Marxism was spreading over Russia and found a fertile ground in the minds of students who doubted their faith. Service to a new Messiah. The hard-working people who were full of self-sacrifice. They compared themselves to the early Christians. Joseph felt that he had found his calling. At last, he had a goal and had found comrades who shared the same ideals. Together, they started attending meetings of an illegal Marxist group. He gave up his studies, stayed late in town, came home late, and spent hours in jail. Even his mother's persuasions did not help. She came to see her son, but found him in jail. When she asked why he was there, he said, "For the book that showed how to overthrow the Tsar." She was terrified and begged him to give up his rebellious thoughts. His soul was torn between pity and anger towards her. There was no point in explaining, as she would not understand. Keke looked at her son and did not recognize him. However, she felt that her precious son had gone down a wrong and dangerous road which she couldn't understand. But where did he get that confidence and that cold stare? These were the eyes of a man who knows what he wants. She did not know that Joseph had already met a person who would change his life forever. At the meetings of the Marxist group, he found a new friend, a senior student at the same seminary, George Gurdjieff, who became a world-renowned philosopher, occultist, and astrologist. When he attended meetings, discussions about the forthcoming revolution always turned to mystical matters.
Это, в общем-то, вот эта тяга к оккультным каким-то ритуалам магическим, скорее черно-магическим, среди пламенных революционеров и большевиков, к сожалению, была распространена под маской материалистов, атеистов и борцов с этим самым, с религиозным сознанием. Они занимались чуть ли не магическими ритуалами.
Gurdjieff possessed ancient magical knowledge. He showed his comrades some rituals, taught the fundamentals of astrology, and even predicted the future. It was Gurdjieff who told Stalin, "You will become a great man and reign over millions of people. But if you want this, you will need to find your own path." He read this as meaning that the revolutionary struggle would bring him greatness. Koba left the seminary. He had nothing more to do there. He continued to attend the meetings of the Marxist group and found a regular job at the Tiflis Observatory.
У тодішній обсерваторії не було ще самописних
At that time, the observatory was not equipped with self-recording devices, and movement of celestial bodies was recorded manually during the day and at night.
що чергування Коби припало на ніч 31 грудня.
Koba's shift fell on December the 31st, 1899, the beginning of the 20th century, in which he was destined to play the most important historical figure on Earth.
Роль в масштабах Землі Коба зустрів
По древним календарям это день самой длинной ночи, самого короткого дня, когда наиболее активны темные силы. И когда появляется герой, который побеждает тьму.
That's because a hero vested with huge power could be born on December the 21st and never on December the 18th, as Stalin had.
В этом гороскопе, в его личном гороскопе, не было власти. Для этого нужно было сделать нечто другое, что он и сделал. И власть появилась.
Pavel Glober helped us to match the meaning of positions of the Sun, the Moon and Mars in the Stalin's first and second horoscopes. Here are the results. The horoscope of the person born on December the 18th, 1878, Joseph Jugashvili date of birth, is that of a powerless and selfish person with many enemies, maniacally stubborn, predisposed to brain diseases and poor health. In contrast to that, the person born on December the 21st, 1879 was the absolute opposite. He was destined to succeed in all his undertakings, would have glory and power and good health. He was straightforward, but would come to power through unkind means. Stalin publicly announced his new date of birth, but only 20 years after his first contact with the astrologist. Why did he spend 20 years working his way to the top under the original unflattering horoscope? Pavel Glober believes that as a mystic, Stalin believed he had to wait for the right moment when a new horoscope would become a vital necessity. And that moment came on April the 3rd, 1922. It was the date of the party convention, which had to make a final decision whether Stalin would become the ruler of the state.
Его сознательное изменение даты рождения и включение нового гороскопа для него был не просто так, а некий магический акт, на который он пошел сознательно, сделал это на съезде, меняет свою анкету, он зачеркивает свою дату, это сохранился, этот вот листок, где это все впервые он делает, потому что до этого в анкетах он фигурирует 1878 года.
The years of birth clearly show that Joseph Jugashvili chose the new horoscope only when he became Stalin. The second horoscope says that year of birth to be 1879.
1879 год – это год желтого кота по восточному календарю. Желтый кот всегда считается, как человек, сидящий в норе, создающий себе свою собственную команду. Кот всегда считался по восточному календарю, это всегда очень хитрое и коварное существо, которое всегда действует из-под тишка.
Caution, careful consideration, guile and meanness. These are the traits which Stalin was known for. In the first horoscope, his year of birth was 1878, the year of the tiger. A person born in this year is characterized by ardor, fervor, enthusiasm, and recklessness. Koba was exactly like that when he started his ascent to power.
Но ничего больше, скажем, умения и показателей на то, чтобы добиться высшего положения в обществе, в этом гороскопе нет. Сильная личность, действительно такой, идущий на крайние меры, но с ограниченными возможностями. Дата его рождения, та самая дата, которой он родился, 18 декабря, это дата сильного человека, сильной личности, но, скорее всего, человек, который занимается террористической деятельностью, либо бандита, уголовника.
That was the horoscope under which Stalin, then known as Koba, began his road to absolute power. He firstly became a member of the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and organized Marxist meetings and demonstrations of workers in Tiflis and Batumi. Those demonstrations were broken up by the police and blood was shed. Koba was shocked. Although it was not the first time that he'd seen death, although back then it had been the death of his comrades at the hands of hostile strangers. Koba believed in a death for a death. The Caucasus choked with blood. Staying in immigration, Lenin was satisfied. We may say that open revolutionary movement has begun in the Caucasus. It was at that time that Lenin first reported about Koba, a reliable leader of the revolutionary underground in Georgia. That was the beginning of his career. And then there were the things that Stalin, the ruler, feared to think about until the end of his life. Things which, if disclosed, could deprive him of the most precious thing in his life, power. That is why he would thoroughly cover up any tracks and destroy any person who got in his way. Lenin and other leaders in immigration took every opportunity to acquire money. They organized armed robberies of banks and of capitalists. In the revolutionary business slang, it was called an expropriation. However, it was risky for the leaders to use their own hands. Besides, there was no need as long as there were reliable comrades in Russia. Koba eagerly tackled the job. He made his friends leaders of the gang. His childhood friend Simon Terpetrosyan, aka Camo, and seminary mate Alexander Svanidze. Over several weeks, the armed gang robbed many special-purpose teams of the state bank with dozens of victims. But Lenin's reserves ran to hundreds of thousands of rubles. Only Kamo and Svanidze knew that those bloody X's were organized by Koba. That knowledge would cost them dearly in the future. Lenin learned about that from Koba and appreciated the help of a comrade from the Caucasus. Since then, Koba's career went uphill. At the same time, Koba came to the attention of the police. He was arrested and put into a cell with criminals. For the police, he was just another criminal. However, his cellmates saw that he was different. They thought that he might be a political leader. Maybe he fought against the Tsar. He should therefore be shown a lesson. Koba might be beaten to death, but when jail guards started beating the criminals, Koba acted in an unexpected way. He grabbed a weapon and started protecting his cellmates. Now it looked like a riot against jail abuse of power, with Koba as the leader of the riot. At first, the criminals couldn't understand what had happened. Then he was exiled to Siberia, but escaped after 2 years. He returned back to Tiflis, where the police knew him by sight. Was it so difficult for the police to arrest Koba and send him to the place from which nobody could run away? It's incredible. He managed to remain in hiding for 4 years. The archives of the former gendarme department kept 3 reports about Djugashvili's arrests. He was arrested, but then released. He had organized bloody robberies, was a jailbreaker, a man outside the law with a forged passport. Why? There is only one explanation. Koba knew how to strike a deal not only with criminals, but with the secret political police as well. In other words, he cooperated with the police in exchange for his personal freedom. To be more precise, he betrayed his comrades. No direct evidence has been found as yet, which may be the reason why Stalin prohibited anyone rummaging through his past. We only know that living in hiding was the happiest and unhappiest time of his private life. During those 4 years, he met and lost his first love. Now they both were members of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, revolutionary underground comrades. It was at his comrade's house that Koba saw the younger sister of his comrade. He was shocked. The girl's resemblance to his mother was striking. It was no surprise that her name was Ekaterina Keke. It could not be otherwise. He was 25 and a tough revolutionary who had been through jail and exile. But beside that 19-year-old girl, he felt like young Soso again. He was so shy and tried hard to hide his passion for Cato. Finally, he asked her to marry him. Cato agreed. She was brought up in the Caucasian traditions and remembered the words of her deceased mother. "Your husband is not the one who conquers you, but the one to whom you submit." The newlyweds settled at Svanidze's house. Cato's sister Maria often came to visit her, and Koba's underground comrade Simon Terpetrosian often visited. Alexander Svanidze and his wife always kept an open table and eagerly invited Koba, Cato and their guests over. The men drank wine, joked and quietly discussed their revolutionary plans. The women did not interfere and had their own conversations. These were the good times. Everybody was young and happy. The only blot on Cato's happiness were Koba's constant absences. Sometimes he'd be away for weeks. When he came back unexpectedly, he would always be greeted with a good meal. Koba was surprised. "How did you know I was coming home today?" She lowered her eyes shyly. "I felt it." The Georgians have a tradition that still survives in places, that a woman does not have the right to sit at a table with a man. She should stand beside him, ready to serve at any moment. But Koba breached this tradition intentionally. He vividly remembered how his father was outraged if his mother was unable to stand near the table, even though she had lots of work to do. He would not be like his father. Koba asked Cato to sit at the table beside him. He put food on her plate and sat so that he could look at her. Once, Alexander Svanidze came round and saw his sister sitting at the table. He threw her an indignant look. How dare she eat a lavish meal in the presence of her husband? Cato's heart stopped beating. She hoped Koba would explain that he liked to watch her eat, but instead, Koba started shouting and complaining that Cato was bad-mannered and ignored traditions. Svanidze could not look him in the eyes. When Alexander left, Koba started scolding his wife. He shouted and stamped his feet. Why hadn't she been sensible and hidden the plate under the table? As he was scolding Cato, he began to despise himself for behaving like his father, the man he hated and never wanted to resemble. Cato burst into tears. Her tears broke Koba's heart. He clasped her to his chest and whispered, "Forgive me, Cato." She forgave him. But since then, uninvited guests would often find a place with unfinished supper under the table.
З роками це дивацтво Коби переросте у манію Сталіна. Він любив примушувати...
Over the years, Koba's eccentricity would develop into a real mania for Stalin.
Очевидно, вкладав це якийсь особливий, лише йому відомий сенс.
He liked to force people to eat and drink, for when a person is eating or drinking, he is especially vulnerable.
Як колись Като. Від коша...
His actions were rebuffed only once when at a crowded reception in the Kremlin,
Гукне своїй друзі.
he shouted at his second wife, Nadezhda Aliyeva,
Ти чому не п'єш?
"Hey, why don't you drink?"
А у відповідь почує: я тобі не...
She replied, "I am not your hey."
Наступного ранку Надію Алілу...
Next morning, Nadezhda Aliyeva was found dead. She had shot herself.
...став останньою краплею в чаші її терпіння.
In 1907, Cato gave birth to a son, Jakov. Koba saw him only in November when he returned after a number of successful exes. When he arrived home, he was surprised to find supper was not on the table. Cato had a fever. After labor, she fell ill with typhus. In the morning, she died. Koba was destroyed. Witnesses said that during the funeral, he jumped into his wife's grave. He cried during the funeral and said, "This creature made my stone heart turn soft. Now she is gone, and I have no warm feelings left for humanity." Koba would subsequently die, making way for Comrade Stalin's rise to power. At the summit of power, he would turn on the new horoscope to separate Stalin the ruler from the half-educated seminary student Djugashvili and the terrorist and criminal Koba forever. The new Stalin would need a new ideologically perfect biography written. There would be no room for any facts about the real Josef Djugashvili. He would change his horoscope and his biography, but he could never change who he was.
Сам Сталин самого себя от своего образа отделял. Вот образ Сталина-вождя отразился в том гороскопе, который он включил для всего советского народа. Это Сталин-вождь. Но жил он по своему собственному гороскопу, о котором мало кто знал.
This dualism was the cause of his unending fear, the fear that he would be unmasked. The new Stalin was never able to renounce the ghost of his past, a past that did not match the image of a Superman, an undisputable leader, a born ruler of the masses. This is the death mask of Josef Stalin. Looking at it, you can easily understand what kind of a person he really was.
Я, например, бы никогда не сказал, что это железный стальной человек. Вообще вот такие вот линии носа и глаз, вот выпуклые глаза, говорят о гордыне и деспотичности, о человеке, который был уверен в себе. Я говорю, единственной здесь чертой – это линия подбородка. Нетерпелив, горяч, вспыльчив, слишком пристрастен. Вот это действительно, к сожалению, это есть, реально. И, конечно, низко посаженные брови. Брови человека, фиксирующегося на обидах. Вот откуда нежелание, неумение прощать. Вот откуда жесткость и откуда такое подавление других.
The only things that disclose his internal lack of self-confidence are his ears. Their position on the head is too low. Usually, such ears belong to people who are not destined to become great. However, these men can become great if they reinvent themselves.
Это люди, учащиеся, которые учатся на своих ошибках. Очень редкая линия ушей. Для человека, который сам себя сделал, эти линии ушей идеальные. Это которые все запоминают, которые живут прошлым, для которых ни один день не является лишним и напрасным, которые постоянно возвращаются к тому, что они прожили раньше.
Even having reinvented himself and gaining power, he turned his back on his past with maniacal consistency. As if waiting to be stabbed in the back by all those people who had witnessed the mistakes of his youth. From those who remembered his terrorist acts and robberies. And from those who suspected that Koba worked for the secret political police. Kamo, a faithful friend of Koba, died in 1922 under strange circumstances. He was run over by a car. This was odd, because there were very few cars in Tbilisi. Alexander Svanidze, Koba's closest comrade and brother of his beloved wife, would be arrested and executed in August 1941. A little earlier, in 1937, Maria Svanidze, who had been a frequent guest of the younger sister Kato and her husband Joseph 30 years ago, would also be shot. Stalin hoped that if he killed anyone associated with his former life, there would be no one to unmask left to him. But he was wrong. Living a lie tormented him for the rest of his life. Gradually, that fear of being uncovered developed into paranoia for the tyrant who had ruined the lives of millions of innocent people. They were poisoned, shot, and deliberately killed in road accidents. In the USSR, the attempted murders were suppressed. But that doesn't mean they didn't happen. Watch the attempts upon all the Soviet leaders, from Lenin to Gorbachev, in one program. The dethronement of the terrorist Fanny Kaplan's myth. Lenin was shot at by the Cheka agents on Sverdlov's order. For the first time, the real circumstances that led to the attempt upon Lenin's life. The famous Russian writer, the author of the bestseller Stalin's Murder. Yuri Mukin asserts Stalin was poisoned by Beria and Khrushchev. The People's Avengers, the Tbilisi students against Khrushchev, a fake policeman against Brezhnev, Andropov, an ascent over corpses and death at the hands of a woman. He has been shooting at Gorbachev. An exclusive interview from Krasnaya Square, where the event happened. The only time Soviet newspapers announced an attempt upon a state leader was when assassins tried to kill Lenin in August 1918. He was speaking to the workers of the Moscow factory of Mikkelsen. Afterwards, on his way back to his car, the socialist revolutionary Fanny Kaplan shot at him. This was according to official reports. And this was the way it was presented in the Soviet propaganda film Lenin in 1918. The legend about an insidious social revolutionary's attempt on the life of the revolutionary leader lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fact that Fanny Kaplan was almost blind and had never shot a gun was classified as secret for many years. Eyewitnesses and even Lenin himself claimed to have seen a man shooting at him. When Lenin gained consciousness, he asked the driver, did they catch him? During the investigation, not one of the witnesses recognized Kaplan as the assassin. Kaplan didn't sign the examination records confessing that she had committed the crime. The truth is shocking. According to the investigation, which has recently been taken off the security list, it was not Kaplan who shot at Lenin, but her comrades from the Socialist Revolutionary Party, Grigory Semenov and Lydia Konopleva. It is strange that Kaplan was arrested and later executed for the crime. Semenov and Konopleva escaped punishment. In fact, their careers began to improve.
Их жизнь, как ни странно, сложилась по-другому. Они потом работали в системе ОГПУ и, по-моему, даже военной разведки Красной Армии, посылались в Китай.
Why? What unknown and mighty power was behind all this? Contemporary researchers assured that Semenov and Konopleva were the Cheka agents and that they executed the order of the most influential person from the Soviet government.
Это покушение очень часто связывали с именем Свердлова. Сложно сказать, насколько эта версия, что называется, правдоподобна. Но вот поводов для нее множество.
Yakov Sverdlov. He was leading the party at the time when everybody was criticizing Lenin for having signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. When all the party leaders were against the treaty with Germany and believed that Lenin had betrayed the revolution, his authority fell to become the leader of the Bolsheviks party. Moreover, he was head of Vitslik, the Central Executive Committee. It was an analogue of the present cabinet of ministers, and nominally, it made him the head of the state. Lenin was the last physical obstacle for him to usurp power. But he had to hide his intention to end Lenin's power behind the insidious counter-revolutionary forces. To put the blame on the social revolutionaries, for example. That's why Cheka has recruited Semenova and Konopleva. And they have taken their fanatical party fellow Fanny Kaplan as a henchman with a view to leave her holding the bag. We are going to make a reconstruction of the real attempt upon Lenin on the basis of the circumstances that have been recently revealed. before nightfall, Fanny Kaplan appeared in the yard of the Moscow factory of Michelson. She asked a worker whether it was true that Lenin had been speaking at the meeting in the grenade shop. The worker confirmed that it was true. Fanny recounted this to a messenger outside in the street. Kaplan did not return to the factory again. 10 minutes later, Semenov and Konopleva arrived. Each of them had a gun in his pocket. Lenin came out of the shop accompanied by factory workers. He was talking to one of them. There were a lot of people around him. And just at that moment, the Cheka agents began to shoot. An injured Lenin and his interlocutor fell to the ground. Terrified people began to scatter. The terrorists left the area. Fanny Kaplan was waiting in the next street. She wanted to know the outcome. Suddenly, a military man arrested her and took her to Lubyanka. The investigator demanded Kaplan take the blame and make a signed declaration. The interrogation lasted till 2 o'clock in the morning, but Kaplan repudiated all the incriminations and refused to sign the report. The next day, after the terrorism attack, the doctors announced that there was no threat to the leader's life. Sverdlov began to urgently cover his tracks. He was afraid that Kaplan would betray her accomplices. Having suspended the interrogations at Lubyanka, Sverdlov took Kaplan to the Kremlin and ordered the Kremlin commandant annihilate the prisoner immediately, in secrecy and without any traces.
Говорил комендант Кремля Мальков, ее, значит, так сказать, положили на пол и сделали в затылок выстрел. Да, а потом сожгли в бочке, просто на территории Кремля. Вот, собственно, никакого суда там не было.
No one knows whether Lenin knew the identity of the real assassins. But several months later, Yakov Sverdlov died under strange circumstances at the age of 34. The official version says that he died from Spanish flu. It is well known that this is a contagious disease. Yet no one who had contact with Sverdlov at that time fell ill with Spanish flu, including Lenin, who was not too daunted to say farewell to his dying comrade. The rumor that Sverdlov had been poisoned existed in the Kremlin even while Lenin was still alive. And these rumors were proved when Lenin ordered the creation of a top-secret poison. Maybe it was Sverdlov's example that gave Lenin evidence that his reprisal method worked.
Существовал отдел при ОГПУ, который занимался изготовлением всевозможных химических ядов, ну, там, скажем, и бактерий всевозможных, для того, чтобы с помощью них убивать врагов советской власти за рубежом или, так сказать, может быть, даже здесь, ну, самыми вот такими невинными способами, незаметными.
This was the beginning of the Soviet leaders' chase, and the principal danger was represented by the closest Kremlin comrades and not by the Western intelligence services or the mythical terrorists. They tried to swallow each other like spiders in a jar, and to enjoy absolute power after that. Coming next, the attempt that did not exist. Why did Beria feign an attack at Stalin? The first Ziz with the guard reached the other side of the bridge without any problems, but the bridge collapsed under another in which Stalin was sitting. The poison laboratory is working perfectly. First Lenin and then Stalin became the victims of poisoning.
С этими ядами он, наверное, уже 1000 раз проклял, что соблазнился на то, чтобы их выработать там для целей войны, а они оказались вот такими для собственного употребления.
From 1922, Lenin fell ill and left the everyday running of the state. The poison laboratory was left to Stalin. Lenin's condition was seen as hopeless, and Stalin behaved as if Lenin was dead. But the patient did not die. Doctors were doing all they could, although he was in a vegetative state. Stalin became increasingly irritated. As long as Lenin was still alive, Stalin could not become head of state. He had to take action. The catastrophe happened on the morning of January the 21st, 1924. Lenin suddenly felt unwell. The cook, Gavril Volkov, asserted later that he had brought him breakfast, but the leader didn't eat it. He wrote a note to the cook in barely legible handwriting. Gavrilushka, I have been poisoned. Tell Nadia and Trotsky. Tell everybody. This fact was revealed for the first time by the writer Vladimir Solovyov in his book Operation Mausoleum. He was referring to the reminiscences of Leo Trotsky and the evidence of a Russian immigrant, Yelizaveta Lesotho, who asserted that she heard it in Moscow in 1924 from the cook Volkov himself. Soon after, he sent a note saying that Lenin had fainted. 1 hour 20 minutes later, he died in terrible pain. So Josef Stalin has finally come to power. He will govern the state for 30 years and remain in a state of panic for the entire time. Even while going from the Kremlin to his dacha, he dictates to the driver where he must turn. What if his comrades have placed snipers in his path? Stalin made only one error, but it was a fatal one. He had made his countryman Lavrenti Beria a close ally. It was 1933. Stalin was the sole leader in the USSR and went on holiday to Abkhazia, to the state of Dacha near the mountain lake Ritsa. The cars in his cortege were armored. The guard was in the first car. Stalin was in the second. In the third were Beria and the People's Commissar for the Internal Affairs of Georgia. In the fourth were the domestics, and in the fifth was the guard. Suddenly, Beria stopped the cavalcade and asked Stalin to move to the fourth car. The leader did what he was told. Beria joined him. The domestics moved to the second car. Stalin nervously asked why they changed places. Beria replied that he had had a sense of foreboding. They easily crossed one bridge, but on the second, something incredible happened. The first Ziz with the guard reached the other side without any problems. But the bridge collapsed under the second car in which Stalin had been sitting. The guards surrounded the fourth car where Stalin now sat and began to shoot in all directions. Because the car had stopped, it was a prime target for terrorists. But there were no terrorists near the bridge. Stalin didn't realize that the act of terrorism was just a show organized by Beria to show the father of the People's Republic how devoted and irreplaceable he was. The leader repaid his kindness. He took his rescuer to Moscow and nominated him the People's Commissar for the Internal Affairs of the USSR. But that was after the feigned act of terror that caused Stalin to fear for his life.
Сталин сам, в общем, измышлял покушение на себя очень часто. Да? И даже был подготовлен целый фильм еще в 1937 или 1938 году, один из первых советских сериалов, он, кстати, так на экраны и не вышел, о том, как Троцкий готовит покушение на Сталина. Ну, в действительности Сталин подготовил покушение на Троцкого и, в общем-то, его и осуществил. Но именно Троцкого он боялся как возможного покусителя на себя.
But we have not succeeded in finding any evidence of an attempt on Stalin's life. His comrades were intimidated. The people were misled by the propaganda about the much-loved leader. Then there was a fearful war. And the great victory was attributed to Stalin using the same propaganda. He continued to fear for his life, with the memories of Beria's attempt causing him to remain suspicious. The famous Russian writer, the author of the book Murder of Stalin and Beria, Yuri Mukin, was convinced that the last years of Stalin's life were full of fear for his own life.
Он подозревал о том, что что-то может быть. Подозревал он по поводу пищи. Охрана говорит, что однажды он приказал перебить, ему привезли вино с Грузии, он приказал его уничтожить. Что-то, какие-то соображения были. Вот вы ему приписывали лекарства, да, вот он рецепт и оставлял лечащий врач лекарства. Допустим, там аспирин или это самое. И вот он, говорит, брал этот рецепт, и охраннику говорит, едь, там рядом какая-то сельская аптека, купи в ней. А эти выбрасывал.
It was this weak point, Stalin's maniacal suspiciousness of his former rescuer, Lavrenti Beria. During the late 40s, when the leader's health was in decline, Beria began to clear the way so that he could take over power. It was on the order of Beria that the chief of Stalin's guard, his personal secretary, the Kremlin commandant and the commandant of Stalin's dacha were arrested. Each of them was declared a betrayer and a counterintelligence agent by Beria. Later, he systematically destroyed all the guards and the doctors who had been in contact with Stalin. They were said to have planned an attempt upon the leader's life.
Глава охраны Сталина Власик, который, собственно, был ответственен за жизнь Иосифа Виссарионовича, неожиданно сам становится заключенным. Его самого подозревают, что якобы он что-то тоже хотел сделать против Сталина. Главный инициатор этого события, естественно, Берия. Берия устраивает дело врача. Это дело приводит к тому, что люди, которые лечили Сталина раньше, теперь уже не могут этого делать. В общем, вот эти два важных края обороны в жизни Сталина, они как бы убираются.
Now, Beria was sure that nobody and nothing could save Stalin. The trap has closed. Watch after the break. Stalin dies a violent death, poisoned by a woman.
И она вызвала сына Сталина. Уже Василий, куда кричал, отравили отца сволочи.
A grenade for the general secretary. What were the Tbilisi students avenging Khrushchev for? A fake or undercover policeman shoots at Brezhnev but hits a cosmonaut. He attempted to assassinate Gorbachev. Alexander Shmonov, the terrorist from Prostok-Vashino.
Высшее лицо же невозможно наказать с помощью суда, только террористическим актом, то есть местью за злодеяния.
On the night of February the 28th, 1953, Beria asked to see Stalin on urgent business. In the cabinet at his dacha, he said that he had damning proof against Nikita Khrushchev, who was allegedly preparing an attempt upon the leader's life. Stalin took an interest. Beria called an assistant with a folder containing secret documents. But before he'd put the papers in front of Stalin, the woman threw liquid in the leader's face. the General Secretary fainted. The woman injected him several times with a slow poison. The writer Yuri Mukin has no doubt that Stalin was poisoned. His evidence is based on medical investigations.
Значит, о том, что Сталин отравлен, я заявил, собственно говоря, первое еще в 2001 году в своей первой книге. Проанализировали лечебное дело Сталина, анализы, проконсультировались с врачами, нашли, что анализы крови показывают наличие яда в организме.
They have put Stalin to bed. The newspapers announce the grave condition of the leader's health.
Все говорят по-разному, по-своему, но суть остается одна. 30 часов Сталин лежал, ему не оказывали помощи. Причем все глухо скрывают лечащего врача Сталина.
Nobody knew the doctor. It was the same woman who had poisoned Stalin. Beria himself appointed her to look after the dying Stalin so that nobody could save him. It may well be so that she repeated the deadly injections.
Охрана, видимо, она уже начала паниковать, охрана Сталина. И она вызвала сына Сталина. Уже Василий туда кричал: отравили отца, сволочи.
5 days later, Stalin is dead. His son Vasily was sure that his father had been killed.
Та слухати його ніхто не став.
But nobody would listen to him. The point is that Lavrenti Beria was not acting.
Його спільниками були кілька
His accomplices were several influential members of Politburo, and Nikita Khrushchev was among them.
після смерті генсека саме між
And after the death of the General Secretary, the main struggle for leadership began between Khrushchev and Beria.
тієї миті, коли Сталін припинив дих,
After Stalin's death, the former accomplices became rivals and bitter enemies.
і заклятих ворогів.
Each of them considered himself to be the worthy successor to the Kremlin throne, and Beria played up his involvement in Stalin's annihilation.
Берия в разговоре там, с частными лицами, с Хрущевым, по-моему, сказал, ну что, вот, если бы не я, вот, я же ведь вас спас. Вот какие-то странные были такие намеки.
At the moment of Stalin's death, Beria was controlling the security service and the majority of the key ministries. This was a definite advantage over Khrushchev. To consolidate his position, Beria started the reforms and was the first to speak out against Stalin's illegal repressions. The members of Politburo were scared because it became clear that Beria would blame them for the mass repressions. It was the only way for the former NKVD chief to discharge himself. His comrades decided to remove the radical upstart. The conspiracy was led by Khrushchev.
Убийство Берии было организовано таким образом. Значит, президиуму ЦК было сообщено, что Берия организовывает вооруженный заговор, вооруженный захват. Для президиума, для того же Молотова, Кагановича, эти вещи были достаточно правдоподобны. И, видимо, Хрущев дает им это самое, что послать к Берии 2 генералов с тем, чтобы они привели Берию на президиум, если он откажется приходить. Приезжают генералы и сообщают: Берия убит. Вот оказал сопротивление и убит. И Хрущев подбрасывает версию. Ну так, а заговор же не раскрыт. Давайте объявим, что мы его арестовали, потому что он организовал заговор. Ну, расследуем заговоры, это самое. И они принимают решение объявить, что Берия арестован и ведется следствие, т.д. и т.п. А Берия был убит.
So Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Just like Beria, he began after the dethronement of Stalin's personality cult. His fervor shocked the majority of the population. It hurt the people to see their ideals destroyed. And it was no surprise that Khrushchev's main enemies were ordinary people rather than comrades. Several students from Tbilisi University have taken the anti-Stalin campaign to heart. When they found out that Khrushchev was going to Tbilisi, they decided that Georgia should become his grave. They carefully planned his execution. One of them will stand to the right of Khrushchev's cortege and distract the guard by throwing a shell from the crowd. Meanwhile, the real killer will pelt the head of state with grenades. The Avengers went to a military unit to get some grenades and shells. They bribed a soldier to tell them all they needed for a lot of money. They hid the weapons on the outskirts of Tbilisi. They were terrified, but the young men were ready to do anything for the sake of justice. But then, the day before the state leader's arrival, they discovered that the military unit was out of ammunitions. The KGB of Georgia was urgently contacted. The night before Khrushchev's arrival, the students were already behind bars. They were liberated from the strict regime colony only after Brezhnev came to power. After Tbilisi, the authorities became paranoid about assassinations. Here's an example. Kiev, Ordzhonikid Street. Now it is Bankova 11. In the house of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Khrushchev was taking part in a conference of agricultural workers. Afterwards, he was heading for the cafeteria. The barmaid was cutting cheese to use in sandwiches. Suddenly, she saw Khrushchev enter the room. The woman rushed over to him with a kitchen knife still in her hand. The guards knocked the knife from her hands and pinned her to the floor. Later, an investigator asked her why a mother of two would want to kill Khrushchev. The barmaid explained that it was not her intention to kill him. She knew Nikita Sergeyevich from the time he was working in Kiev in the same building. She served him donuts and juice every day and just wanted to greet her former client. They didn't believe her and sent her to an asylum. She wasn't married, and so her children were sent to a children's home where they were registered under invented surnames. They didn't believe the barmaid's story because the whole country was unhappy with Khrushchev's policy. People were complaining about the absence of food in the shops, of exorbitant currency reforms, of high prices, and the failing economy. The ill-conceived army reforms led to patriotic soldiers venting their anger at Khrushchev. Khrushchev did not suspect there might be an attempt on his life. Ordinary citizens and members of the Kremlin elite were both dissatisfied by his policies. In the summer of 1964, the members of the Politburo were discussing Khrushchev's removal from power. The most radical of these was Leonid Brezhnev, who Nikita Sergeyevich had helped career-wise. Maybe we should remove him completely, insisted Brezhnev. Poison him, for example. But the plotters had dethroned Khrushchev without bloodshed and maiming. With support from the majority of the Central Committee members, they voted for his dismissal. When he arrived, the job was done.
Вот тут закончилась власть. Он приехал в Кремль, там уже шло заседание, достаточно мирно, да, скажем, вроде бы ничего такого не произошло. А все, Никита Сергеевич, вы уже никто. А если там я где-то выступлю? А если вы где-то выступите, Никита Сергеевич, что вы, конечно, можете сделать, то мы вынуждены будем опубликовать документы о том, как вы сами принимали участие в репрессиях на Украине, например. О том, как вы сами были ответственны за ликвидацию скажем, деятелей коммунистической партии. Не просто за ликвидацию, а за убийство, которые вы лично инспектировали.
Khrushchev lived his last years on the dacha near Moscow under special services supervision. Brezhnev, who had become the leader of the Soviet Union, governed the state for 18 years. Only Stalin ruled for longer. He ended Khrushchev's experimentations, improved industry and food production. But he did not start any major reforms. On the contrary, he eradicated the beginnings of Khrushchev's democracy. Over time, dissatisfaction spread amongst the people. Those not satisfied with Brezhnev's politics began to riot. Among them was the junior lieutenant Vladimir Ilin, who was serving in the army near Leningrad. His decision was maturing for a long time, but after the engagement of the Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia and the suppression of the Prague Spring, the junior lieutenant decided that there will be no democracy and no freedom under Brezhnev. It was time to save the Soviet country, to kill Brezhnev. Coming next, how the cosmonaut Beregovoy almost died because of his bushy eyebrows. The General Secretary Andropov was killed by an offended woman. The shocking confidence of the terrorist Shmonov. His regrets not killing Gorbachev.
Целился в голову, потому что, может быть, бронежилет у него одет. Жалею, что не удалось.
January the 21st, 1969. Ilin heard on the radio that the following day, Moscow was greeting the cosmonauts back from their flight. And he heard that Brezhnev would be there. That night, he stole 2 guns, some cartridges, and ran away from his military unit. Ilin arrived in Moscow on the morning of January 21st. He stayed with his uncle, who was a former policeman. The next morning, he put on the police uniform and prepared to carry out his act of terrorism. He entered the Kremlin without any problems and stopped near the Diamond Fund. "What are you standing here for?" a man asked sternly. "They have posted me here," said Ilin. The civilian left. Suddenly, Ilin saw a cavalcade of black cars entering the Kremlin. He recognized Brezhnev in the first Chaika. Or was it him? Ilin became excited. Yes, it looked just like him. The junior lieutenant withdrew 2 guns from his pocket and shot 16 bullets at the windscreen behind which Brezhnev was sitting. But the terrorist had got it wrong. The car contained the cosmonauts. One of them, the commander of the spaceship Soyuz 3, looked just like Brezhnev. The glass from the windscreen injured his face. Another cosmonaut, Andrei Nikolaev, had an injured shoulder. The elderly driver, Ilya Zarkov, was killed. The injured Nikolaev seized the wheel and parked the car. But where was the real Brezhnev? His guard had been informed the day before about an extraordinary event, the escape of an armed officer. Which is why the general's car left the government cortege and entered the Kremlin through another gate. Ilin was arrested on the spot and isolated in a mental hospital for 20 years. A sentry stood guard over him. In the late 70s, it became evident that Brezhnev would not be in power for long, and the General Secretary aspirants began a new life and death struggle for the throne. The youngest member of Politburo, Fyodor Kulakov, who was 60 years old, had a fair chance. But in 1978, he suddenly died from cardioplegia. The day before, his guard and doctor left his dacha. Somebody had made sure that there was no one available to save the pretender to the throne. The first secretary of the Central Committee of the Belarus Communist Party, Petro Masharov, was popular in the state and was considered to be Brezhnev's natural successor. But in October 1980, he died in a road accident. A truck loaded with 5 tons of potatoes made way for the first car of the cortege on the Moscow-Minsk road. But then it blocked the way of Cheka, where Masharov was sitting. The government limousine smashed into the truck at full speed. All the passengers were killed. There were rumors in the government lobby that the chief of KGB, Yuri Andropov, was behind these murders. He was not considered to be the main contender for the post of General Secretary, but he persistently continued with his aim, ignoring all the corpses. It was impossible to prove, but the death of politicians close to Brezhnev and the persecution of the General Secretary's relatives by the KGB subordinated to Andropov had to be more than just coincidence. The only rival Andropov failed to remove physically was Nikolai Shiolokov, the chief of another power department of the USSR, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Andropov demanded that Brezhnev dismiss Shiolokov. He was defending his protégé to the last. Only after Andropov became the head of state did he throw Shiolokov out of his job and ordered the KGB to investigate his corrupt activity. The former rival was going to suffer the penalty. But Shiolokov shot himself during the investigation. His wife had shot herself 6 months earlier. But before her death, she committed a reckless act which turned out to be fatal for Andropov. The wife of Shiolokov's Svetlana was trying to save her husband. On February 19, 1983, she launched an attack on her neighbor Andropov. A bullet injured the USSR leader's kidneys. This exacerbated a chronic disease which led to his death. Andropov had been head of state for only 1.5 years. In 1984, the state was headed by the extremely fragile Konstantin Chernenko. Before meetings of the Politburo, they would sit him in a chair and place a short speech in front of him. Then they asked the others to come in. Chernenko read with great difficulty the sentences written by his assistants. He ruled for about a year, even less time than Andropov. When the post of the General Secretary was taken by his successor Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was no longer a huge superpower. There was an ongoing crisis with General Secretaries being frequently replaced. Gorbachev's appointment as the General Secretary and his policy of perestroika split the state. Some were zealously supporting his reforms, others saw him as the enemy of communism. In 1987, inhabitant Teimuraz Kabahidze came to Moscow to kill Gorbachev. He had a homemade gun in his pocket. There was a demonstration in Krasnaya Square, and he got there through a column of workers. The terrorist saw the architect of perestroika greeting people from the tribune of the mausoleum. He was about to take out his gun, but it went off in his pocket. Kabahidze was badly injured. The assassination attempt failed. 3 years later, in the same Krasnaya Square, Gorbachev almost died again. There was a demonstration of workers on the anniversary of the October Revolution. the head of the state was standing on the tribune of the mausoleum as usual. Among those who Gorbachev was greeting was the resident of Polpino of Prostok-Vashino district, Leningrad region, Alexander Shmonov. He had a sawn-off shotgun hidden under his coat. The ordinary metalworker had been preparing for this day. In order to obtain his rifle license, he had been a member of the Hunters and Fishermen Association for 3 years and had been shooting at the targets every day. Alexander Shmonov talked openly about his secret operation.
Кто-то знал про ваши планы?
Ну, мы вдвоем были, значит, с человеком. Он с пистолетом. Его задача была ко мне никого не подпускать. А моя задача, значит, стрелять в Горбачева. Но он в последний момент передумал и прошел мимо вместе с колонной демонстрантов.
То есть вы поняли, что вы сами остались, да?
Да, я
все равно решили стрелять?
Ну, пришлось, да, все равно решил стрелять.
Shmonov took his weapon out in 12 seconds. He was an experienced shot, scoring bullseyes from 100 meters away. There were only 47 meters between him and Gorbachev. The terrorist from Prostok-Vashino took aim.
Достал ружье, снял с предохранителя, начал целиться в Горбачева, вот туда вот. Прицелился, начал нажимать спусковой крючок, и в этот момент ко мне подбежал сержант, схватил ружье, ружье дрогнуло, и пуля в этом мавзолее пролетела.
Now, you're going to see the sensational attempt on a Soviet leader's life immortalized on tape. It was accidentally filmed by a camera operator of the film unit Darts. A policeman on point duty, Andrei Milnikov, jumped in front of the leader, saving the president's life. He grabbed the muzzle of the rifle and turned it away. The Jacan bullet, with improved penetrating power, flew over the mausoleum.
Еще бы, если на полсекунды позже подбежал ко мне этот сержант, то, я думаю, успел бы выстрелить прицельно. Он целился в голову, потому что, может быть, бронежилет у него одет. Вот. Ну, жалею, что не удалось.
Shmonov was arrested and sent to a mental hospital for 4 years. After that, he was imprisoned in Lefortovo for a further year. Having been liberated, the ex-terrorist wrote a book about his unsuccessful attempt. Shmonov's act of terrorism resonated for years to come. His possessions are still in the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russian Federation Museum. For example, here is the coat he was wearing on that day. And this is the sawn-off rifle he used. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's comrades were plotting to remove the General Secretary in a different way. They did not poison him or hire a killer. They blocked the state leader in his dacha on Foros together with his family. The so-called putsch of Gukachip occurred in August 1991. But this last collective attempt upon the state leader undermined the Soviet Union. 4 months later, it collapsed. But the independent states which appeared after inherited some of the worst Soviet methods of problem solving.
Когда мы говорим действительно о большой власти, мы все равно говорим о большом риске, потому что там разреженный воздух. Там всегда можно получить и пулю в лоб, и отравленный пирожок, и отравленное письмо, и отравленного голубя, который случайно залетел в форточку.
The road accidents, the shots on the staircase, dioxin on the dacha, a suicide in his own house, a hunting accident. These are just the tip of a huge iceberg that is modern politics.